All right, welcome along. Hi guys, hope you are all really well. Welcome along to the paper two session for A-Level Edexcel Economics. Those of you that are not Edexcel, fear not, a lot of the overlap between content is still relevant to you guys. The exam technique, of course, is focused very much on Edexcel, but those of you that are different examples, just apply it to your exam technique. Just a couple of things before we start. So first and foremost, listen, it's up to you guys what you do in the 2, 3 hours that we have together. My advice is to not be on the chat. You can go on the chat if you want to and waste your time there, but in all honesty, just lock in, engage with everything that I'm going through. I will cover as much as I possibly can. Thank you very much for all of you that have sent over lots and lots of questions and lots of topics. I don't know if I can cover everything. I will do my very best. Those of you that are kind enough to have gone through previous years' lives, I can't remember what I went through in previous lives, so there may potentially be some overlap. But regardless, my priority is to make sure that you guys are as ready as you possibly can be for Monday. So, with that in mind, let's get going. So, the first thing that I want us to start talking about today is exchange rates. And there are 2 to 3 types of questions they can ever ask about exchange rates. But I need you to understand, firstly, what an exchange rate is and some common misconceptions about exchange rates. Because very often people think of an exchange rate as the same thing as inflation, and they are not the same thing. Inflation is a change in the price level. So, for example, if I sell this pen and today this pen costs £1, if the pen became £1.50 tomorrow, that is inflation. An exchange rate, though, is the value of one currency in terms of another currency. In other words, how many pounds do you need to be able to buy, let's say, $1? Yeah. And now it's really important to understand that the typical question that you're likely to get is the causes of an appreciation or a depreciation in the exchange rate. So let's start. And the best way to start is to run through what's actually based on a past paper, but a question. So imagine the context you were given in the extract is that inflation in the UK is high, right? Which actually is pretty relevant right now. So inflation in the UK is high. How does that affect the exchange rate? Well, what's really important to understand is that I always want you to deal with it in terms of supply and demand. Simplify, and I want the simplest route possible towards the answer. So the axes are going to look like this. We're going to have on the y-axis the price of pounds in, let's say, dollars. So it could be any currency, by the way. And then on the x-axis, it will be the quantity of pounds. And then very simple, supply and demand. S1, D1. Okay, right. There are often 2 routes towards the same answer. But my preference strongly is for you to choose the option that is easier to understand and easier to explain. It is not about making overly complicated points. That will not score you extra marks. I need you guys to understand that. So we said, look, inflation is high in the UK. So the way to look at the impact on the exchange rate is either in terms of exports, imports, or something called hot money, which I will deal with in a bit. All right. So imagine if I told you that if inflation is high in the UK, do you guys agree that that means British goods are less attractive in the global market? Higher prices makes us less attractive. So is the demand for our exports likely to go up or down? Logically speaking, if people want to buy less of our goods, demand obviously goes down. If there is less demand for British goods, is there more or less demand for the British pound? Correct answer, obviously, is the demand is decreasing. And once you draw that, you'll now be able to see what happens to the exchange rates. Because as you can see, demand shifts in, and the pound, the fancy way of describing that, depreciates. Yeah. Now, if it happens, by the way, in a floating exchange rate where there's no intervention by the government or the central bank, it's called a depreciation or an appreciation. We'll deal with revaluation and devaluation in a bit, but that is the first kind of route I wanted to take you through. Yeah. So when you've got inflation, you go, okay, that means that we're less price competitive on a global basis. That means our goods and services are less attractive. And if our goods and services are less attractive, there's less demand for them. Therefore, there's less demand for our currency. Nice and easy. Right. Second scenario. Let's say that we've got higher wages. So for some reason, British workers have been paid more. Yeah. And again, we want to work out what that does to the exchange rate. And this is how we deal with it. So let me rub this out. Oops, sorry. Okay, those of you that, by the way, that are watching this on TikTok, I highly recommend that you switch over to YouTube because on YouTube you can actually watch what I'm drawing. So again, same axes. So we're gonna have, here we go. So price of pounds in, again, let's just do dollars. And this is the quantity of pounds, yeah? And then we've got supply, S1, and demand, D1. Okay, right. Let's talk. So the context was that wages being paid to British workers have gone up. The way that I want you to remember this is through one of the topics that you learnt about in theme two. In theme two, you learnt about conflicts between objectives. And one of the conflicts between objectives was that when there was economic growth and people have more money, they'll spend more in the economy, but that doesn't impact the exchange, the current account. But they will also buy more from overseas. Do you guys agree that if you earn more money, you'll buy more in the UK, so that counts as consumption, but you'll also buy more things from overseas. What does that count as? That counts as an import. Hence why the conflict in theme two was economic growth versus the current account. Economic growth goes up, the current account deficit widens, it gets worse. Yeah? Right, with that in mind, then, if I suddenly have more income and I want to buy more goods from overseas, how do I buy things from overseas? So if I want to buy something, let's say from Italy, how do I actually do that? Not all of you probably screaming, oh, you exchange your pounds into euros. And that's not wrong, that's valid. But I don't like that as an explanation. And the reason I don't like it as an explanation is because it doesn't paint the full picture. The way to understand how exchanges actually take place or currencies exchange is that there must be a buyer and there must be a seller. You must be selling something to buy something. So, what I mean by that, imagine that you're going on holiday to Italy in the summer and you need euros to spend in Italy. When you go to one of those exchange booths, yes, I agree that you exchange your pounds into euros, but what are you actually doing? What you're actually doing is that you are selling pounds and you're buying euros. Do you guys understand? So, in other words, in order for you to get another currency, to buy another currency, you need to sell your currency first. So, in this context, if we're going to import more, it means that we're going to need to sell pounds to be able to buy any other currencies. And if we're selling more pounds to be able to import more, what is shifting now? Hopefully, you understand that supply is shifting outwards. There are more people that are selling pounds in the foreign exchange market. By the way, to be clear, you and I buying items in the UK has no bearing on this. This is the foreign exchange market where people are buying and selling currency. So if you want to go and buy things from overseas, you need to sell pounds and you need to buy whatever other currency you're buying. Supply this time therefore shifts out. And once again, this causes the pound, as you can see, to depreciate. Does that make sense? I need you guys to always, always, always look at it through the lens of exports, imports, or hot money. Yeah, we'll deal with hot money in a moment. Yeah. Now, a good example of a question where this came up, there are two actually. The first is June 2016, Unit 4. It's a question about Ghana. Yeah, so the first extract is about Ghana, and the term marker is two causes of why their currency, the CEDI, CD, it was spelled like this. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but why it had depreciated. And they gave you like a really long extract. And in that extract, there was just one paragraph where the entire answer was, where it said the following. It said there was a 75% increase in public sector salaries. That just is the thing that I showed you, right? So if Ghanaians earn more money, what do they do with their money? They're going to basically buy more in Ghana, but that doesn't impact the current account. But it doesn't impact the exchange rate, sorry. But they'll also import more. How do they import more? They sell the Ghanaian currency, the CEDI, and they buy other currencies. Supply would have shifted outwards, yeah? A generic evaluation for a question like that, by the way, is that it depends on something called the marginal propensity to import, which is called the MPM, right? What does that mean? Marginal is a fancy way of saying one more unit. Marginal propensity means for every extra like £1 that you earn, or in this case, every steady that you earn, how much of it do you, and in this case, import? Because think of it this way. If Ghanaians earn more money, but they use the majority of their added income to spend in Ghana, well, then that isn't a major factor behind the depreciation of the currency, right? Because there wouldn't have been many people selling it. Whereas, on the other hand, if they import a lot, if most of the things that they buy now with the extra income is from overseas, that is a major cause of the supply shifting out and the currency depreciating. That's a nice generic eval. The other one was it said there was rapid inflation in Ghana, and that was the first thing I began this live. Because if inflation is high in Ghana, that means that Ghanaian goods are less attractive in the global market. The demand for Ghanaian exports therefore go down, and if there's a decrease in demand for Ghanaian exports, there's a decrease in demand for Ghanaian currency, hence why demand shifts in, it depreciates. Those are your two reasons. Generic evaluation that works all the time for that as well, by the way, is that it depends on relative inflation. Because if you've got high inflation, but your main trading partners have even higher inflation than you do, then actually you are price competitive. That's the kind of thing that you could do, yeah? Now, again, by the way, again, generic evaluation is if you were dealing with like a Eurozone economy, we'll deal with the Eurozone later. The evaluation there is that relative to your main trading partners, you can't be price competitive or less price competitive because you all use the same currency. Yeah. So therefore, really, in terms of exports and imports, it's probably no impact. The exchange rate, therefore, probably isn't impacted by that. Yeah. But anyways, right. That is our starting point. Now, the third context, I'm going to give you the context, but I'm going to go on a wild tangent and we will come back to it in a moment. The third context is imagine that the central bank in the Eurozone, so the European Central Bank, now adopt another round of quantitative easing. And the question now is, what is the impact of that on the UK pound? So, I promise I will eventually answer this. But before I answer it, we need to go on a tangent. One of the things that a lot of you were asking about is quantitative easing, understanding what it is and how you can answer questions. By the end of today, you'll be able to answer not just 12 markers like in June 2024 or June 2017, but also 25 markers on it. So let's deal with quantitative easing. Now, in order to understand quantitative easing, I need us to go and do a slight history lesson. If I rewind to the year 2009, so the financial crash has occurred, banks have lost tons and tons of money, and the central bank are desperately trying to get aggregate demand to shift out. So what do? They cut the base rate, the Bank of England, from 5.5% all the way down to what was then a record low of 0.5%. Now, I will run through the financial crash later in this session, but in a nutshell, banks have lost so much money that they were just like, you know what? Nah, I ain't going to lend anymore. They don't reduce their interest rates anywhere near the level the Bank of England have reduced theirs by. Yeah. So the Bank of England then adopts something they have never done before, which is quantitative easing. And this is how it works. To understand quantitative easing, you need to understand what a UK government bond is. And this is what a government bond is. A government bond is a way for the government to borrow money. So imagine I'm the UK government and I need to borrow some money to spend on, I don't know, infrastructure projects or whatever it is, right? I issue this thing called a bond. And let's say hypothetically you, the investor, go and buy the bond. And for argument's sake, let's assume the bond costs £100. Right, so what does that mean? That means that you just lend me £100 and in return you get this piece of paper, it's called a bond, which says, hey, I, the UK government, pledge that I'm going to pay you back that £100 that you just gave me. Thank you very much for that loan. And of course, on top of it, you're going to get some interest on top of it. Cool? So, from your perspective, you do this because it's a safe way to grow your money. From my perspective, it's a great way for me to borrow loads of money. Yeah? So, if I'm the government. Now, one of the most important relationships that you need to understand is the relationship between the price of a bond and the yield. The yield is a fancy way of saying the interest rate paid out by the bond, and that they are inversely related. But I want this to make sense. Economics is logical. It's not just about memorizing stuff. I need you to be able to work things out in the exam. So let's understand what that means. Imagine a really safe economy like Switzerland issues a bond tomorrow. Yeah? Now, people are very risk averse, meaning that they don't like to take much risk. What does that mean then? That would mean that the demand for Swiss bonds, do you guys expect this demand to be high or low? Obviously, demand is going to be very, very high, right? Loads of people are therefore bidding to buy a Swiss bond. That causes the price to be really high. In order for you to get a Swiss bond, you need to lend the government a lot of money for that bond. The interest on the bond, though, is going to be very, very low. Why? Because you know you're going to get your money back. Therefore, they don't need to entice you with a crazy high interest rate. So, in other words, high price, low yield. Okay. If I look at a developing economy, so let's say Angola, June 2023, if Angola decide to issue a government bond, do you guys agree the demand for their bonds are likely to be fairly low? And therefore the price is fairly low, and the interest on the bonds is therefore going to be very, very high. Yeah. And that is really important to understand. I have a whole video on quantitative easing that you can watch later. But in a nutshell, that's how bonds work. Yeah. So imagine now the following scenario. So if I draw it out over here, yeah. You guys hopefully are aware that when you go and put money, deposit money in your bank, so let's say you bank with, I don't know, HSBC. Yeah, so here's a HSBC. Yeah. HSBC do not just sit there waiting for you to come back. They don't just basically sit there and go, it's a safety vault, you can open like a key and swim in your money. What they do with your money is that they take your money and they lend it out and they invest it and they try to grow it. Yeah. I think, I can't remember the exact number, but I think if it was something like if everyone tried to withdraw £50 at the same time from the same bank, the bank would collapse. They wouldn't actually be able to honor it. So, anyways, in a nutshell, HSBC are sitting on millions and millions, possibly billions of pounds worth of money, and they need to invest it to try and grow the money and make more money from that. Now, if you think about it, they're going to take some low risk investments and some high risk investments. One of the low risk investments they're likely to make is obviously government bonds. So here's HSBC. And HSBC are sitting on millions and millions of pounds worth of these UK government bonds, which, by the way, if you want to be fancy, are called gilts. Yeah, so UK bonds are called gilts. To be clear, only UK ones are called gilts. Every country has a different name. But anyways, right. So here are HSBC are sitting on all of these bonds. But the problem with these bonds is that they are what we call an illiquid asset. Right. So illiquid. What does that mean? An illiquid asset is an asset, so something that's worth money, something that you own that has monetary value. But because it's illiquid, you can't quickly convert it into cash. In other words, it'll take a long time for it to actually materialize into actual money. A good example of an illiquid asset is your house. Because you guys agree that your house is obviously worth a lot of money. But if you put a for sale sign outside your house, are you going to get someone walking by with a massive sack of cash who just gives you the money and then they take the house? Obviously not, right? It takes a long time for you to sell the house. It's an illiquid asset. Well, bonds are illiquid. And the reason why they are illiquid is the maturity date, the date which you get paid back in full plus all the interest, varies from short-term bonds that are 3 months And there are long-term bonds that are 30 years. Some countries even have 40-year bonds, right? So let's say on average, HSBC need to wait about 8 years for this bond or these bonds to materialize into actual cash to get paid back the loan that they gave the government plus the interest. Step fourth, the Bank of England. And it's really important for you guys to understand the Bank of England are separate to the government. They are not the same thing. So here is the Bank of England. The Bank of England turn around to Barclays and the other commercial banks and they say, hey, listen, don't wait 8 years. Yeah. We will pay you right now for your bonds. We'll give you money. In return, give us the bond. So what does that mean? HSBC now sell their bonds to the Bank of England. And in return, the Bank of England inject what is called electronic money, which is essentially they make money out of thin air. Yeah. But to be clear, there is a transaction taking place here. The bonds are now being held by the Bank of England, meaning when the government repay it, it will be repaid to the Bank of England. But now, as HSBC, do you guys agree that you've actually got money in your account sitting there that you can now lend out or do whatever you want with? Does that make you feel more or less confident about lending money? Well, hopefully you realize that it makes you feel a lot more confident about lending money out compared to sitting on an illiquid asset. How do you lend out more? How do you encourage people to take out more loans? Well, in very simple terms, you do one thing, which is that you lower your interest rate. And it loops back to that. Because if you remember what I began with, I started by saying that the Bank of England cut the base rate from 5.5% to 0.5%. But commercial banks were reluctant to lend. Therefore, they didn't really lower their interest rates very much. Therefore, the Bank of England did something they'd never done before, which is this quantitative easing. In a nutshell, then, quantitative easing is just encouraging banks to lower their interest rates. That's all the question becomes. The moment you define quantitative easing, and it's in my video, the moment you define quantitative easing, the question is, what is the impact on the economy of low interest rates? Is that a hard question? Hopefully not for most of you, but let's just go through it together anyway. So this, by the way, if you want a reference, June 2017, paper 2, question 60, and also repeated, show you how repetitive Edexcel exams are. June 2024, also the 12 marker. 2017 paper is about the Eurozone. 2024 is about the UK. Anyway, it's literally the same question, yeah? So this is what the question was. It was basically about whether quantitative easing can help improve or raise the inflation level in the economies, yeah? Both times, inflation was really low to the point of it being potentially in deflation, yeah? Okay, so once I define quantitative easing, all I now do is I go, okay, the effect of quantitative easing is to lower interest rates. And therefore, if interest rates are low, are people going to save or not save? Well, the answer is that when interest rates are low, you have less incentive to save because the amount that you get back on your savings isn't as high. So savings go down. If savings go down, consumption obviously goes up. The other way to think of it and to add depth to it is to say, okay, when interest rates are low, are individuals going to borrow more money or less money, right? So are you going to use things like your credit card more often or less often? Well, if interest rates are low, it's cheaper to borrow money. Therefore, you're more likely to take out loans. You're more likely to use your credit card, which again results in consumption going up, right? So the cost of borrowing basically is lower. And so as a result, you are going to borrow more and you're going to consume more as an individual. And we can add to that in that same paragraph, investment, to give it a little bit of depth, because firms also borrow money in order for them to invest. Well, for them, cost of borrowing is also now lower, and therefore investment is also going to go up. So that paragraph, after I define quantitative easing, I now say, and I probably, by the way, quote from the data, it will always tell you how much quantitative easing they're doing, like 60 billion euros or whatever it is. You now go, when interest rates are low, and these things happen, right? And you go, consumption and investment are both components of AD. And thus, a rise in consumption and investment are likely to cause AD to shift outwards. Investment is also an injection into the circular flow of income. And so there is likely to be a positive multiplier effect, which allows us to show off a little bit. We now draw the diagram. And the diagram, as I'm sure you've seen a million times now, it's going to look like this. So here's real GDP. And, and here is price level. And then just a standard Keynesian LRAS curve. Just really quickly while I draw this, by the way, one of the most common questions I get is when do you draw the SRAS curve rather than the LRAS curve? And my answer very simply is that it's only when you're shifting SRAS itself that you would draw SRAS, in my opinion. Like, as in, otherwise, just always draw LRAS. Classical, never really for Edexcel. They would probably draw it for you maybe in a Section A question or ask you to draw it in a Section A, but not more than that, yeah? Anyway, so here we go. We start with AD being, let's say, over here, 81. That's Y1. That's P1. And then AD shifts out once because we said that consumption and investment are going up, right? But then we can kind of show off a little bit. Obviously, time permitted, by the way. Like if you're running short on time, you don't need to do the second shift. But the second shift is the multiplier. And then here we go. Right. It's really important, by the way, in economics exams, especially macro exams, to answer what the question is asking you about and not what you wanted it to be. Yeah. Because the question was clearly focused on inflation. So I can talk about growth briefly, but do not labor and waste too much time talking about growth. It's specifically, does it achieve the objective of raising the price level? Yeah, it does. Yeah. Because as you can see, there is demand pull inflation because the price level rises from P1 to P3. That is 8 marks of analysis every single day of every single year. Yeah. It's 100% 8 out of 8 in terms of analysis. Yeah. You define quantitative easing, you applied it to the data, you talked about consumption and investment, AD shifted, drew the diagram, talked about inflation. You're good. You got 8 out of 8. Trust me. Yeah. So that's how you get the 8 out of 8. Yeah. Right. Let's quickly do an evaluation. And then I did say I would go back to the exchange rate stuff. I promise we're going to go back to the exchange rate stuff. There is an utterly genius evaluation here. Yeah. And the utterly genius evaluation is to recognize that quantitative easing is never plan A. You don't do quantitative easing as the first port of call. You do this when your interest rates are already super duper low and it's still not working. And therefore, there's a real danger that the Bank of England, when they're doing this, are going to be suffering from a really fancy concept called a liquidity trap. Right, let's understand what a liquidity trap is. The best way to understand it is with a made-up example. So, add page. Okay, right. So, obviously, so let's say this is the Bank of England, and let's assume that they are so desperate. Now, they've never done this, but the Eurozone has. The Eurozone, for example, in the June 2017 paper, you'll see in the extract it mentions they cut their base rate to minus 0.3%. Yeah. That's not to say that you and I are going to get negative interest. We're never going to get negative interest, but it means commercial banks borrowing from the Eurozone or the European Central Bank, sorry, would have been getting negative interest. Yeah. So that, yeah. Okay. Now the UK's never done it, but let's just assume they're so desperate, the Bank of England, that they set the base rate to minus 1%. What does that mean? Well, that means that if Barclays take out a loan of, let's say, £100, they need to repay the Bank of England £99. Okay. So you think, whoa, great. Barclays surely going to lend to absolutely every single person that walks in the bank. Anyone that wants a loan, they're going to give them a loan, right? But that's not true. Because from Barclays' perspective, if they give out a loan to someone that's not creditworthy, that's got a bad track record, and that person then turns around and can't repay the loan, what happens? Well, if I give you a £100 loan and you default, which is a fancy way of saying that you declare bankruptcy. So if you default on that £100, do you guys agree that I still have to repay the Bank of England £99? I still made a loss of £99 as Barclays. Therefore, there is still a risk tolerance. I still factor in whether I want to give someone a loan and at what interest I would give that person a loan. And let's say that Barclays have worked out that from their perspective, the lower limit of what they're willing to reduce their interest rates to happens to be, and I'm making up complete numbers here, let's just say it's like 3%. So even if someone is so reliable, someone is really kind of like prudent, they've got a really good income, they've got a great track record of paying back money, but from their perspective, they're like, listen, this is the lowest amount of interest I'm willing to give out on a loan. Now, the reason why, by the way, there's a lower limit as well, one of the reasons is not just with the risk, because the alternative is that Barclays can lend out to the UK government. So let's say the UK government, the bond loan, let's say it's like 2%. In other words, if I lend £100 to the UK government, I get £102 back. Now, who's safer, the UK government or an individual or a business? Well, realistically, it's probably the UK government. The chances of the government defaulting and declaring bankruptcy are so low that realistically, you know you're going to get your money back, right? Okay, if that's the case, then in what world would I lend to an individual at the same rate that I lend to the Bank of England? Sorry, to the government. Therefore, I'm not going to do that. So Barclays decide, they worked out for them 3%. No matter what happens, I am not lending below 3%. The Bank of England, desperate. They're like, please, guys, please lend. They lower it to minus 2%. Barclays shrug their shoulders and go, nope, don't care. I'll buy more bonds. I'm just not going to lend out more than 3%. 3% is my lower limit. And realistically, if you're adopting quantitative easing, it's a sign of desperation. Therefore, the evaluation then is this, is however, there is a danger that the Bank of England may be suffering from a liquidity trap. This is where monetary policy becomes ineffective, as commercial banks such as Barclays may have already lowered their interest rate to their lower limit. Given that the Bank of England base rate, so this is 2024 by the way, it references it, was set at a record low of 0.1%, which is basically zero, yeah? 0.1%, there is every chance that commercial banks have already set their interest rates to their lower limit. Given this, monetary policy or quantitative easing may have no effect. That is sensational evaluation, by the way. Now, if that's a bit complicated and that's not the easiest evaluation to get your head around, no problem. I got you. I got your backup. That's also very good. And it works both in June 2017 as well as in June 2024 as well, which is this. The whole question was about whether quantitative easing was going to basically lift the inflation level up, like the price level. Yeah. So let's draw it out. Now, it's implied in the data, by the way. And you would know this at the time because if you were seeing it at the time. I mean, even right now, the growth rate UK announced today was 0.6%, which is actually a lot higher than we expected it to be. Prior to that point, we were very sluggish. It was like 0% growth rate, 0.1% growth rate. Yeah. So where am I on the LRAS curve? The LRAS curve, by the way, for you guys to understand, is basically the PPF. Yeah. And realistically, the economy, if you look at the 2024 extract, it was during like COVID when they cut the base rate to 0.1%, is probably operating somewhere over here. Yeah. It's not doing particularly great. So even if aggregate demand does shift outwards, the problem that you've got is that it may not shift out enough. It may just shift and remain at spare capacity, in which case, does it have any impact on the inflation rate? No, it doesn't. That's a very good evaluation. Again, it worked both in June 2017 and June 2024. There's clues, by the way. They always give you clues throughout the extract. So obviously the fact that, it was during COVID for 2024. But if I just actually show you guys, 2017, because I want to show you a part of the extract where you can kind of, it's hinting to you. Even the 15 marker, by the way, itself is a hint that, hey, this is a valid evaluation for this question. So let's quickly go to June 2017, A2. Right. So here. So here's a question. It says, discuss the likely success of the ECB's quantitative easing program in moving Eurozone inflation closer to the central bank ceiling of 2%. Cool. The clue, by the way, is the 15 marker. The 15 markers discuss looser fiscal policy and then supply side reforms, forget that may be used by governments of Eurozone countries to increase economic growth, right? If they're clearly indicating that their economy is not growing or their economy is like, growth rates are low, where are they likely to be? They're probably likely to be at spare capacity. But even then, if that's not obvious, the more obvious one is this. It's this quote. Mario Draghi, Mr. Draghi, stressed again that monetary policy alone could not restore the Eurozone to economic health. He called for looser fiscal policy among member states to support aggregate demand. In other words, we are realistically operating at spare capacity, and if AD shifts out but not enough, it does not resolve the underlying issue they're trying to fix here. Works in June 2017, works in June 2024. Cool. Let's go back. Now that we've gone through quantitative easing and hopefully have an understanding of what quantitative easing is, let's go and readdress what I said early on in the live, which was the context. So those of you that are on TikTok, my phone has died on us. So unfortunately for you guys, you're not watching anymore. I'll go back when I can. Right. So the context of what I was basically showing you guys. Oh, is this also gone for me? Oh, wait, hold on. So I'll explain it while I reconnect my board. My board's also failed me. But the context was the following. It said that the European Central Bank are adopting quantitative easing. Yeah. So how does that impact the pound? Because obviously the European Central Bank is not the UK government. If they're adopting quantitative easing, what is the point of quantitative easing? Well, quantitative easing, as hopefully you know now, is you're trying to encourage banks to lower their interest rates. True? So if I'm getting commercial banks in the Eurozone to lower their interest rates, think about what investors now do. Hot money. Hot money is basically investors moving their money into or out of a country based on wherever interest rates are highest. Well, hot money is going to flow from where? It's going to leave the Eurozone because interest rates are low in the Eurozone and come where? They'll come to the UK. Obviously, other parts of the world as well, like America, but you can go, hey, it's going to go into the UK. How do people from the Eurozone put their money in the UK? Do you guys agree that they sell euros? What do they buy? They buy British pounds. Therefore, if you draw it out, I'm trying to reconnect my phone because my board doesn't work without it. But what happens is the demand for pounds is going to shift outwards. Hopefully that's really straightforward and you have a good understanding of kind of the key points to look for. So just a real quick recap. There are three things that I wanted to look for when it comes to the causes of inflation. Number one is exports. Are you exporting more or exporting less? If you're exporting more, then people are going to demand more of your currency. If you're exporting less, they're going to demand less of your currency. Imports. In order for you to import more, you're going to need to sell more of your currency. And finally, hot money flows. If hot money is flowing into your economy, people are buying your currency. If hot money is flowing out of your economy, then people are selling your currency to buy other currencies. Supply would therefore shift outwards. Yeah. All right. Let's quickly just run through a quick paper while I try and reconnect my board and sort out the awful technology. And it's from June 2013, Unit 4. Okay, so what's going on with this phone? Is it dead? Oh, it's back. All right. So June 2013 has an extract about Brazil. And annoyingly, it's an 8 marker. It's probably more likely to be a 10, hopefully, if you guys get it on Monday. And it says this, examine the, no, sorry, with reference to extract 1, analyze 2 reasons why the value of the real, Brazil's currency, has appreciated. Okay, So what I want us to quickly do is, without even reading the extract, list as many things as you can think of that will cause the real to appreciate. And remembering that it's to always supply and demand, either supply shifting inwards or in this case, demand shifting outwards. Yeah. Right. Bear with me while I quickly reconnect my board. It's more important than TikTok, to be honest. And right, 1 second. Screen share. Right. Bear with me. Right. Very annoying. Doesn't work. I'm gonna need to connect. Okay, right. So let's go through the extract. The extract basically has a handful of really obvious reasons as to why the real would be appreciating, starting with the following. So if you look at the extract down here, it says the following. Here we go. Uh, this. He argues that quantitative easing schemes have cheapened the world's major currencies, leaving his as one of the few attractive ones around. Now, this is actually a more complicated point than I need you to do, but because we just did it a second ago, let's recap, yeah? Quantitative easing being taking place in places like the USA, the UK, what does that do? Well, what it does is it results in interest rates in those parts of the world going down. And if interest rates in those parts of the world are going down, do you guys agree that that means that hot money is flowing from those areas to where? Well, to Brazil, yeah? But the far easier one is this, is high interest rates have meant Brazil is one of the most attractive places for the world's super rich to save their money. Yeah. Again, what does that mean? It means that hot money is going to be flowing into Brazil. How do you buy or how do you get Brazilian currency? You sell your currency and you buy whatever other currency there is in the world that you need to buy. Yeah. Does that make sense? Cool. The very last thing, by the way, here is it also speaks about like high levels of foreign direct investment. It also speaks about how China is buying a lot of soya beans and iron ore. How do Chinese people buy more Brazilian exports? They have to buy their currency. So the demand was shifting outwards. A generic evaluation, by the way, if you're ever stuck, is to go, okay, this might be temporary. That actually the appreciation of the currency, it might start to depreciate. And one of the reasons why it could depreciate is because of the fact that it said that there was huge economic growth in Brazil. So as Brazilians earn more money, do you guys agree that what they're going to do is they're going to start to import more? How do they import more? They sell the real and they buy other currencies. Cool. Right. Hopefully, I have managed to reconnect my board. If anyone was on the live on TikTok, I don't know if there's a way to tell people, but they need to just basically come back onto YouTube because TikTok is not happening. My phone is not handling the heats. Okay, right. Let's share my screen again. And we've dealt with causes of exchange rates. Now, there are two types or three types of exchange rate systems that you need to know. The first is a floating exchange rate, which is pure supply and demand, which is what I've just done. And then we've also got a fixed exchange rate. I'm going to briefly explain to you how a fixed exchange rate works and also why they do it. Edexcel don't realistically ask you questions about comparing the two, by the way. Other examples do. Edexcel, as far as I'm aware, from 2009, I mean, I know, not I'm aware, have never asked a question like that. Not say they can't, but it's not likely, yeah? So this is what a fixed exchange rate is. A fixed exchange rate is essentially where you announce from the outset that your currency is going to be moving in tandem with another currency. In other words, if let's say we decided, we aren't, but let's say we decided that the pound is going to be fixed against the dollar. That means that whenever the dollar appreciates by 2%, the Bank of England are going to intervene and they're going to make the pound 2% stronger, which is called a revaluation. So they can revalue it. Okay. And then if, for example, the dollar depreciates by, let's say, 5%, the Bank of England again are going to intervene and they're going to devalue the exchange rate. Okay. So to be clear, a depreciation or a appreciation is caused by supply and demand without any intervention by the government or the central bank, whereas revaluation and devaluation is where they're purposely making it stronger or weaker. Okay, how do they do it? The best way to understand this, I'm going to do it through Brazil since we just looked at their currency, is in a two-step process. Now, every single country have what's called foreign reserves. Yeah, in fact, that's one of the limitations to economic development that we'll talk about later. But foreign reserves is a fancy way of saying other currencies. So foreign reserves for the likes of Brazil would be dollars, yen, euro, pounds, any other currency basically, yeah? So here's the price of, let's say, real in, let's say, dollars. And this is the quantity of real. Okay, right. So supply and demand as per usual. Now, what is really important to understand is that I always want you to do step one as the thing that you need to do to your currency. And then step two, you do the opposite with your foreign reserves. So let's try and revalue the real. Let's make it stronger. So imagine the central bank in Brazil goes, you know what, we want to make the currency stronger because the currency they were fixed against, if they were in a fixed exchange rate, it's appreciated by 3%. We need to revalue our currency by 3%. Now, They can either be a consumer and buy real, or they can be a producer and sell real. Think about it. If I want to make the real stronger, do you guys agree that I need to buy real? I need to be a consumer. Because if I buy real and become a consumer, which curve am I? Demand or supply? Well, obviously, I would be the demand curve. Demand, therefore, would shift outwards. So, can you guys see? And you can draw it to see it that causes the real to get stronger. It revalues it. Yeah. Now, what did I do? Step one was I bought real. So you're going to buy real. And because you're buying real, you must be selling the other thing. What's the other thing? Foreign reserves. Yeah, just other currencies. That's how you revalue the currency to make it kind of fix it against another currency. Let's now do the opposite. I want to devalue the real. So, you know what? Save time. Let's just undo a few times. So now what do I do? Well, think about it. If I want to make the real weaker, so not revalue, let's do devalue. Okay, so if I want to devalue the pound, how do I do that? Wait. Well, now I have to become a producer. I want to sell real because if I sell real in the foreign exchange market, and supply would shift outwards. And as you can see, the real now devalues. Cool. So again, what did I do? Step one was I sold real. So sell real. Therefore, I must be buying something. I'm buying foreign reserves. I'm buying other currencies basically as the central bank. And that's how you do it. Does that make sense? So that's how you do it. And very quickly, why do you do it? It ties into what we're going to do later today, which is that it's for trade purposes. Because if you're an exporter or an importer, do you guys agree that the worst thing that can happen is overnight, the country that you do most of your trade with, your currency collapses compared to them? That means that everything that you're selling is now super cheap and everything you're buying is now crazy expensive. Loads of businesses will therefore go bust, right? So, what does that mean? Fixing your exchange rate gives you a lot more confidence and a lot more kind of sustainability because you know for a fact that the exchange rate is going to move up and down in tandem with your main trading partner. Cool? That is a fixed exchange rate. The very last one, by the way, is something called a managed exchange rate. Managed exchange rate is where officially you are a floating exchange rate, but from time to time you're intervening to make the currency stronger or weaker. The other name, by the way, for a managed exchange rate is a dirty float. Okay. What does that mean? The reason why it's called the dirty flow is because it's seen as like dirty tactics. The fact that you're doing this at certain moments in time to advantage your economy, but disadvantage, it could lead to what's called like a currency war potentially. Yeah? Again, Edexcel are not really big on that, but it's just useful for you to know. Now, in the 2024 paper, was it 24? Yeah, it was 2024 paper. The 25 marker was talking about how Brazil had devalued their currency, and you'd obviously now know how they did it to try and correct their current account deficit. Cool. That is going to be the question that we're going to do in a moment, but not yet. The question I want us to do is one of the dream questions that we can get on Monday. One of the dream questions that we can get on Monday is June 2015, Unit 4. Let's do it. 12 marker. Because there is a very systematic way that I want you to approach macro type questions. So let's get some very ball into us. So there's an extract here about India. Here we go. And if you're lucky enough to get a 12 marker like this, thank you, lucky stars. You should get 12 out of 12 like that. Yeah. It says, assess the possible effects of the fall in the external value of the rupee on the Indian economy. Lucky days for you. Yeah. First things first. They try to word things in a way to confuse you guys, but honestly, like that shouldn't be too confusing. When they say a fall in the external value, what does that mean? It just means that the rupee is weaker compared to other currencies. What's that called? It's a depreciation. Yeah. Now, from now on, whenever you're dealing with appreciation, depreciation, and also inflation, by the way, I know they're not the same thing. What I want you to think of as your trigger point is to say to yourself, is this economy more price competitive or less price competitive? And the current account, there are two countries that I always bang on about. The two countries I always bang on about are Germany and China. Right? Why do people buy Chinese goods? Well, people buy Chinese goods because they are cheaper. Therefore, China are what we describe as price competitive. Germany are not cheap, but Germany are known for their brands. They are quality competitive. Mercedes, Audis, I don't know, like Volkswagen, Adidas, Puma, etc. These are all German brands, yeah? So if you're just thinking along those lines when it comes to like the current account, it's a very easy way to kind of develop your analysis. Because here we go, okay, if the rupee has depreciated, does that make the Indian economy more or less price competitive? The answer is obviously more price competitive. And as soon as you do that, you're in happy land because now you're going to say the following. You go, as a result, exports out of India are likely to rise. And this is where you can use the data, by the way, because the data will tell you what it is that they export. It says that they have a pretty good services sector, so they can export more services. Yeah. At the same time, imports are likely to fall. Oh, sorry, by the way, when you explain why exports are rising, you need to explain why to give yourself depth. And the easy why there is as other currencies can now buy more rupees. At the same time, imports are likely to fall. Why? Because the rupee cannot buy as much in the global market. The combination of rising exports and falling imports helps to reduce India's current account deficit. And there's some more real world knowledge for you to apply. Look at figure three. Figure three shows that their current account deficit is in mad deficit. 4% is pretty big, by the way. 5% is when it's like really alarming, but 4% is still bad. So you go, look, it can help reduce their deficit, which is currently 4% of GDP. Easy application, yeah? And that's your first paragraph. In other words, the current account is now getting better, yeah? Now, if the question just said the impact on the balance of payments, you're done. You cannot do any more analysis. That's all that you need to do. Now, if you're lucky enough that it says impact on the economy, like here, though, there's more to say. But I just want to show you an example of a question where it just was balance of payments. It was actually June 2017, paper two. So paper two, June 2017. Look at their question over here. 10 marker is the following. Since mid-2015, the euro has appreciated. Assess the likely impact of an appreciation of the euro on the current account or the balance of payments for eurozone countries. It's the opposite. So now they're less price competitive. So countries like Spain are going to export less. You justify why. They're going to import more. You justify why, right? Current account, therefore, for these economies is going to get worse. Cool? That's how you would deal with it. That's the analysis there. But that one was specifically the balance of payments. Our question that we're dealing with about India is the impact on the Indian economy. So we can write more. And we write. What we now say is, you go, X minus M is also a component of AD. And so if the current account is getting better, AD is likely to shift outwards. Exports are also a injection into the circular flow of income. And so there's likely to be a positive multiplier effect. You draw the diagram I drew earlier where you shift AD out twice, you summarize it, economic growth will go up, unemployment will go down. High five the examiner, the invigilator, you just got 8 out of 8 in less than 8 minutes. Happy days for you. And now we need to evaluate. And this is where I need us to go and talk. So let me stop sharing. And let's talk about the best evaluation by miles. The best evaluation by absolutely miles and miles and miles. And the one that I ideally would want you to do in a question about the exchange rate appreciating or depreciating, and you've done the impact on the current account, is something called the Marshall-Lerner condition. And it is imperative that you just know how to talk about this and that you can comfortably incorporate it into your exam. The Marshall-Lerner condition, in a nutshell, says the following. It says that for anything that you've just said in the analysis to materialize, so in our example of India, for the current account to actually improve, the Marshall-Lerner condition must be satisfied. This states that the sum of the elasticities of imports and exports must be greater than one. Now, I am aware that in a previous live, I talked about it being the average. I had a long chat with ChatGPT, which explained why it's not the average. I'll show you through the maths why in a second. But what you're going to say is it's the sum of exports and imports need to be greater than one. Now, if they're greater than one, what does that make them? Hopefully, you know that PED greater than one is elastic. Okay. I need this to actually make sense. So you'll never realistically be asked to do the maths, but I feel like for your peace of mind, can I run through the maths? Because the maths hopefully sheds light in terms of why this theory is valid and why it's such a good evaluation. So let's make up some numbers together, yeah? Let's assume that the PED for India of their exports happens to be minus 0.2, and the PED for their imports is also, let's say, minus 0. I don't know, 4, yeah? So if you ignore the minuses, because PEDs will always be minus, because as prices rise, demand will go down. As prices decrease, demand will go up, right? You're adding 0.2 to 0.4, which obviously is 0.6. Is the Marshall-Lerner condition satisfied? Well, no. And so I'm going to prove to you guys that because the Marshall-Lerner condition is not satisfied, the Indian current account is not going to get better. It's going to get worse. And let's just do it with really simple numbers. I know that they don't use the pound as their currency. I know it's rupees, but can we just do pounds for the sake of like making it easier for ourselves? So let's assume hypothetically that the pound has depreciated by 10%. Yeah, so let's do the UK then rather than India. Yeah. And to begin with, let's assume that we are exporting a good that we sell for £1 and we are exporting 100 units. So how much money are we making on our exports to begin with? Well, hopefully the maths isn't too challenging for you and you know that £1 times £100 is £100. Wow. Yeah. At the same time, well, the thing that we're importing is costing us £1. So we basically need £1 to buy whatever we're importing from the world. And we are importing also 100 units. Okay, so how much are we spending on imports? Again, £100. Insane. Yeah. So to begin with, X minus M in this completely made up example is balanced. It's equal to 0. Cool. And now the pound depreciates, right? What does that mean? Well, PED of exports is the percentage change in quantity demanded of exports over the percentage change in the price. And it's equal to, in my made up example over here, we've set it equal to minus 0.2. Okay. So in terms of other countries that are buying our products, Do you guys agree that when the pound depreciates by 10%, our goods become 10% cheaper for them? Their currency can buy more of our currency. So for them, that means that the price of our products are decreasing by 10%. So if I get rid of, let's just put a line through it, that, and make it into minus 10. Yeah, because we said the pound depreciated by 10%. That means the exports are 10% cheaper. Let's rearrange that formula to make the percentage change in demand the subject. What do you guys agree? The percentage change in quantity demanded of exports is simply equal to minus 0.2 times minus 10, which hopefully you can do the maths, is plus 2. What did we just work out in words? What we worked out in words is that British firms, or in the context of India in a second that we're going to go back to, are going to export 2% more when the currency depreciates by 10%. Okay, so let's plug it in. So if we do it back over here, what do we get? Well, this is the thing why before when I was saying average, this is the bit that chat clarified as incorrect. We are still selling our good for £1. It's 10% cheaper for them because their currency can buy more of our currency, but it's still £1. So we still charge £1 for our exports. However, we're now exporting 102 units because it was 2% increase on obviously 100 is 102. So we're making more money on our exports. Good for us, £102. But now let's work out what happens to our imports. So again, if I plug it in, PD of imports, what do I get? Percentage change in quantity demanded of imports divided by the percentage change in the price. It's equal to my made up example over here, minus 0.4. Okay, again, the currency has depreciated by 10%. What does that mean? Does that mean that our imports are 10% cheaper or 10% more expensive? Hopefully you understand that if our currency is weak, everything that we're buying from the world is now 10% more expensive. In other words, the bottom of the fraction is plus 10. It's more expensive for us to buy imports. So now I take that to the other side. What do I get? Hopefully the maths is really easy. I did the 10% on purpose for you guys. 10 times minus 0.4 minus 4. What does that mean? In simple terms, we're going to import 4% less than how much we used to import before. But now let's plug it in and see what happens. So watch this. Okay. The difference now, though, is that do you guys agree that because our currency is 10% weaker, that means that in order for us to import, or we were importing before, we now need to pay £1.10. It is 10% more expensive for us because our currency is weaker. So, whereas before it was costing us £1 to buy our imports, it's now costing us £1 10 pence. And how much are we importing? Well, we said that imports fell by 4%. What is a 4% reduction on 100? Hopefully the maths isn't too challenging for you guys, and you get 96. And then, how much are we now spending on our imports? Well, 1.1, I'd love to say I could do this in my head, I probably could, times 96, 105.60. What does that mean? Can you guys see that that means that we're now in a deficit of £3.60? X minus M is no longer equal to 0, it's minus £3.60 because the Marshall-Lerner condition was not satisfied. And because it wasn't satisfied, our current account got worse, not better. So you begin and by saying that, however, for there to be an improvement in India's current account following the depreciation of the rupee, the Marshall-Lerner condition must be satisfied. This states that the average sum, sorry, not average, I'm bad habits. This states that the sum of the price elasticities of imports and exports must be greater than 1. This is because every unit exported out of India is now cheaper, whereas every unit imported into India is now more expensive. But we're not done there. Once we do Marshall-Lerner, what I now need you to understand is that you are always going to draw something called the J-curve. It comes as a pair. Yeah, I want them together. It will get you all the 4 marks. And the J-curve looks like this. So the axes are going to have the following. We're going to have time, and then the current account on the y-axis. Current account. And this is positive. This is negative, yeah? Okay. You always begin, by the way. So we know obviously the current account is in a deficit for India based on the extract. And if you're not sure, you can assume they're in a deficit. They're not going to penalize you unless it's really obvious that they're in a surplus, like China or Germany, yeah? And you begin with nothing happening. So you just do that. Okay. So you go, there you go, nothing. Yeah. And then the way to work out how to draw this diagram is to say to yourself, whatever I said in the analysis, the opposite happens first. So in the analysis, we just said, hey, the current account is going to get better. So we say to ourselves, initially, it's going to get worse. So the current account becomes more deficit, and then it goes up. And this is the exact moment in time where the depreciation occurs. Yeah. So that's depreciation of rupee. How do you spell it? It's double E, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Right. How do I explain that? Well, basically, very simple terms. It shows the J curve illustrates that in the short run, India's current account is actually likely to worsen. This is because Indian firms are likely to be tied into trade contracts. And so exports and imports are not likely to rise very much or go up or down very much. In other words, is the Marshall-Lerner condition satisfied? It is not satisfied. In the long run, once the Marshall-Lerner condition is satisfied, India's current account will begin to improve. Does that make sense? Now you can kind of really show off. I mean, very, very great to just like, write depreciation of the rupee. But can I show you a couple of examples where you could have been like ultra nerd? June 2018, the 25 marker is about how the UK, following the Brexit referendum, the pound sharply fell against the dollar. And it was like the impact on the economy of that, yeah? So the first analysis would obviously be like, more price competitive, the current account's going to get better, blah, 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 right? That point there, where I write depreciation of the rupee, if I wanted to be the biggest nerd in the world, I could do one of two things, yeah? The first super nerd thing, well, let's start with like basic nerd and we'll do super nerd, is write Brexit referendum, because that's the moment where, it happens. But if you wanted to be next level nerd, you could write the date of the referendum if you do like politics. Obviously, at the time, you'd have known this. So 23rd of June, 2016, I think, yeah, was the referendum. But there are opportunities that creep up where you don't need to know it yourself in terms of real world application. It gives it for you. So, for example, look at June 2024. Watch this. June 2024. This is paper two. Yep. Here we go. 25 marker. Nice 25 marker, by the way. Was the following. Here we go. In 2021, Brazil's current account deficit on the balance of payments was 46.12 billion US dollars. The Central Bank of Brazil intervened to sell its own currency, the real, on September 23rd, 2022. Yeah? Okay, so just to be clear, them selling the real is them, it's like a dirty float, right? It's a managed exchange rate. They're selling it and therefore buying what? They must be buying something. They're buying foreign reserves. When they sell their currency, the supply of their currency would shift out, causing their currency to depreciate. Why? Because that makes them more price competitive. And then you go, hey, that means the exports are going to go up out of Brazil, going to sell more coffee beans and soya beans and whatever you read in the June 2013 extract. They're going to import less because of the fact that their currency can't buy as much in the global market. Exports rising, imports falling, current account deficit shrinks. Does it achieve what their objective is? Yes, it is, because they have a massive deficit. Then you evaluate and go, well, it depends. Marshall Lerner needs to be satisfied. And then you drop the J curve, but then you turn into ultra nerd and you do the following. So it said, what date did it say? It said 23rd of September, 2022. Double application. There you go. Yeah. So that's how you basically get easy application. No, bear in mind, you may not know the date sometimes. It might be just depreciated, just write depreciation as well. That's completely valid, but I just want to show you guys easy ways of getting some extra application marks. Yeah. Okay, right. Just really quickly before I move on from this, is that if the currency had appreciated, like for example, the June 2017 paper, your analysis is the opposite, right? So you're talking about how the current account is getting worse, exports are falling, imports are rising. Justify why? And then the diagram, I'll draw it over here really quickly, would look like the following. So imagine I've got the axis time current account, right? It would do the opposite. Yeah? Because remember what you said. You say to yourself, whatever I've said in the analysis, the opposite happens first. So in our analysis, we would have been like, hey, the current account is going to get better, so worse. So initially it's going to get better, it does the opposite, and then eventually it gets worse. And that's exchange rates. And hopefully that's really clear. Let's go. Let's move on to another topic. One of the things that is obviously very, very topical is to understand protectionism, understanding what protectionism is and how to answer questions on protectionism. So let's start at the very beginning. What is protectionism? Well, protectionism is the polar opposite of globalization. Globalization is where there's free trade, where countries are removing barriers to trade. Protectionism is placing barriers to trade. And there are three main types of protectionist policies that you need to know, but only one of which that you need to know the diagram for. So if you've been taught other things, they can't examine you on those things. I'm not interested. Number one is a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports. Number two is a quota, which is an upper limit on what you allow to come into your economy. And number three is domestic subsidies, yeah? Which, by the way, is referenced in the Lock specimen paper, paper two, which I'll talk about in a sec. Right, let's start at the very, very kind of beginning. Let's start with a tariff. And I want to make sure that you guys really, really understand how a tariff diagram is constructed, why it looks how it looks, and how you can use it as either analysis or evaluation, because it's a very useful diagram to know. So let's draw the following. So price, quantity. Yeah. Now, You are obviously going to know the country that has imposed the tariff if it's in a data response. It will tell you, yeah? So let's say we're dealing from the perspective of the USA, because obviously that's fairly topical. So here is the supply of, I'm going to make up an example, by the way, let's say electric cars, yeah? So this is SUSA, okay? And then this is the demand in the USA as well. Yes. So obviously you'd write the country depending on which country it's about. So the 2021 paper, for example, is about Rwanda imposing a tariff on secondhand clothing. You'd write S Rwanda and D Rwanda. Yeah. Anyways, the first thing to recognize is that I do not want you to label the equilibrium for this diagram because the equilibrium point would only occur if they were a closed economy where there did no trade whatsoever, which is not realistic. What we're instead going to do is we're going to start by setting a world price and it must be set below the equilibrium. So this is the world price. Another world price. This is the initial world supply. Right, let me explain why it's perfectly elastic. The logic or the assumption is that at that world price, we assume that everyone must sell at that world price. You've got no choice but to sell at that world price because if you try to charge even a penny more than that world price, no one's going to buy it off you. We assume everyone's like a price taker, which I know is a big, big assumption to make, but it helps us to construct this diagram. Now, every single time you have a price, you need to recognize that now you can tell me how much is supplied and how much is demanded by simply going across from that price until you hit the relevant curve. Well, do you agree that at world price one, which curve did I just hit there? Well, we hit supply. So let's start down and call that Q1. Right. That is domestic supply. In other words, that is the amount of electric cars that are going to be manufactured in the USA. Is it, in this diagram, high or low? Hopefully you recognize that it's pretty low. Look, quantity like starts there. That's not very, very high. Why? Why is it low? The logic of why it's low is that a supply curve tells me at different price points how many units firms are willing to sell. So as the prices rise, you have more incentive to sell more and more and more. But this world price is below the equilibrium in the USA. Therefore, it's not that attractive. American firms go, do you know, I'll make some electric cars, but I'm not going to make very many. So they'll make Q1 units. But demand, on the other hand, can you see that world price hits demand all the way over there? Demand is massive. It's Q2. Consumers, why are they demanding so much? Again, economics is logical, yeah? Do you guys agree that the price is really low? Therefore, consumers are like, I want loads of electric cars. It's super cheap. I want an electric car. But now we have a discrepancy. And if I do it in like made up numbers, let's say this is in thousands, yeah? Let's say that this quantity over here was like 10,000 and this quantity over here was 90,000. What does that mean? That means that only 10,000 electric cars are being made in the USA, but consumers in the US want 90,000 electric cars. There's an 80,000 discrepancy, the excess demand. Where must you get your electric car then if you want to buy it but can't buy it in the USA? You need to buy it from overseas. And when you buy something from overseas, what is that called? It's called an import. Therefore, the distance between Q1 and Q2, and hopefully that makes sense now, is M1. It represents the initial level of imports. That is how many electric cars in my made up example are going to be imported into the US, yeah? Now the US government, Donald Trump decides, hey, time for a tariff. And he imposes a tariff on electric cars. That means the world price is now going to go up because every firm selling an electric car into the US has to pay a tax. So world price 2 is here. Let's raise it to like that. Okay, and this is now WS, world supply, plus tariff. All right. Before we do anything, let's understand logically what's going on. The first thing we need to recognize is, okay, at that world price, where does it hit the supply curve now? Well, can you hit, you see it hits supply there, so Q3. Has supply increased or decreased in the USA? Well, the answer is it's increased. And the logic of why it's increased is because the price is higher. Therefore, American firms go, hey, you know what? They don't pay the tax. They go, everyone's charging a higher price for electric car. I have more incentive to make electric cars. So there's an extension along the supply curve from Q1 to Q3. Demand, on the other hand, decreases. There is a contraction along the demand curve from Q4 to Q2. Why? Because consumers can't afford to buy as many electric cars and the new higher price. Therefore, the new level of imports is this. It's decreasing, yeah? Which makes sense, yeah? Now, this diagram, what's amazing about it is that we can now label the following. This is A, this is B, this area is C, and this area is D. Okay. There are three agents or three players in any economy. And if you're ever stuck, by the way, in a macro exam, just remember those three agents and answer in relation to one or two of them, and you're going to get marks. So the first agent or the first player is the consumer. Now, if you hopefully remember from theme one, consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum price the consumer is willing and able to pay for a good and the actual price they pay for the good. So let's write consumer surplus over here, yeah? And there's a three dot exercise, if you follow, that you'll always be able to work out the area of consumer surplus. Step one, the consumer, firstly, is it the supply curve or the demand curve? Obviously, it's the demand curve. So can you guys see that demand hits the axes there, yeah? So that is the upper limit of what consumers are willing to pay. Let's put a dot there. So that's the first thing. The second thing I say to myself is, okay, what price did the consumer initially pay for the good? Well, they initially paid WP1 for electric cars. And then you go across from that price until you hit the demand curve, because that's how many electric cars in total, whether it's from the US or from overseas, that consumers are buying. So there. Can you guys see the three dots? That area is the initial consumer surplus area. Cool. Let's do the exact same exercise. But now we go, okay, the maximum price consumers are willing and able to pay for the good. Has it changed? No, it hasn't. Still this. So let's do it as a square. Yeah? What has changed though is the price they now pay. Because of the tariff, the wild price now goes up to WP2. There. And then I go across from there until I hit the demand curve. Well, it hits it there. All right, so compare the dots to the squares. What has happened clearly to your consumer surplus area? Hopefully, you recognize the fact that your consumer surplus has fallen by area A, B, C, D. The consumer gets demolished. Yeah. Therefore, consumer surplus is minus A, minus B, minus C, minus D. That in and of itself, by the way, if the question is like a 12 mark about the impact on consumers, is the evaluation or potentially analysis, you could be like, consumers are way worse off. Consumer surplus decreases by A, B, C, D. They face higher prices. They have less choice. The quality of the goods they get might even deteriorate because of the fact that inefficient firms in the market that wouldn't have survived are now in the market surviving. Yeah. Anyways, consumers way worse off. Producer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between the minimum price the producer is willing and able to sell a good for and the price they actually sell the good for. Which curve is the producer? Well, obviously the producer is the supply curve. Can you guys see the lowest price they're willing to sell it for is here? I'm going to do it as like an open circle. Yeah. What price did they initially sell it for? Well, they initially sell it for WP1. So that's the second dot or second point. Then I go across until I hit this supply curve, which is there. So the initial area is that little triangle there. Yeah. Okay, same exercise. The minimum price that the producers are willing to sell it for. Do you guys agree? It's still there. The supply curve hasn't shifted. Not domestic supply. I know world supply has. Domestic supply hasn't shifted. So that's the lowest they're willing to sell it for. What price do they now get though? Well, now they get this price, WP2, and I go across until I hit the supply curve. In other words, can you see that producer surplus has increased by area A? So producer surplus plus A. The last player that you could talk about is government. And the government, whenever there's a tax, are always going to collect tax revenue. In theme one, if I said to you that there's, let's say, a £5 tax on a packet of cigarettes, and I go, tell me how much revenue the government made. What else do you need to know besides the tax rates? Do you guys agree that you need to know how many units are sold? Well, what's a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imports. And you can only collect tax revenue, by the way, on the imports that come into the economy after the tariff is announced, not before it was announced. Therefore, the width of the area must be Q3, Q4. Can you guys see that? Because that is the new level of imports, and the height of the area is the tariff, the tax rate itself, so it's area C. The government collect tax revenue equal to area C. Cool? Right, let's deal with two types of questions that can realistically come up in terms of protectionism. Let's start with June 2022. So 25 marker on protectionism. And it has the following. Right. So 25 marker said the following. So it gives you some context about China and US and basically increasing tariffs and blah, blah, blah. Then it says, evaluate the likely impacts of an increase in protectionism on the global economy. Now, global economy questions are a bit awkward, and the best way I think to deal with them is to break your analysis up into two sides. One side of it is going to be to do with the exporting countries, and one side of it is to do with the importing countries. So let's start with the basic one, which is the exporting countries. If you are China or Germany, do you guys agree that from your perspective, tariffs are going to be pretty bad for your current account? Because suddenly now your export earnings might start to go down. You might struggle to sell your goods in other parts of the world where there are tariffs, like the USA. So if you're, let's say, a German car manufacturing firm, you aren't able to sell your cars as easily into the American market once there's a tariff in place, right? What does that do to your export earnings? Your export earnings are going to go down. What does that do to current account surplus? Current account surplus is going to shrink. X minus M is a component of what? AD. AD therefore might shift inwards. A lack of demand, by the way, for your goods overseas leads to a lack of demand for labor because labor is derived demand. Therefore, cyclical unemployment in Germany might go up. More people get sacked because of the fact that there's less demand for their cars, right? AD shifts inwards. You can draw it. Economic growth goes down. Unemployment goes up. That's your first analysis. So in that one analysis, you basically address the fact that exporting countries, their current account is going to get worse. And you can talk about how that means that X minus M shifts AD in, economic growth goes down, unemployment goes up. Happy days for you. Yeah? All right, let's evaluate it. How do you evaluate it? A very, very good evaluation to talk about is one of two things. One is it depends on the PED. So if the demand for their exports are price inelastic, then realistically, even if there's a tariff in place, they can probably continue to sell into that economy. They could just pass over the higher price to the consumers in the USA. Especially if they're high quality, like German cars, for example, it might be that people are willing to pay the higher price in America, in which case export earnings may not be affected that much. But the second thing you could talk about is it probably alters the pattern of trade. And I'll hopefully try to speak about pattern of trade later. Pattern trade is essentially like where are goods going from and to where, yeah? And in Germany's case, do you guys agree that actually the majority of Germany's trade is probably to whom? It's probably to other countries in the Eurozone who they have free trade with, who they share a currency with, right? In which case, if the American market is not a massive market for them, and yet America are the ones imposing a tariff on them, they might not be that bothered. They might just basically like start exploring other markets like China, or they might start exploring other markets like, the developing world. In other words, it may not be that big a deal. They might be able to export to other parts of the world and not be impacted by this, yeah? That is the first half of the essay. The other half of the essay is now dealing with it from the perspective of importers and talking about why it's either a good thing or a bad thing. I do not mind. I'll go through a variety of different options, yeah? If you talk about importers, it will be like the USA in this case, right? Well, we can discuss how it's extremely bad in the sense of consumer surplus is going to get really badly hit, right? Consumer surplus goes down by area A, B, C, D. So we draw the diagram and go, oh my God, disaster for American consumers, yeah? But you can go one step further. And to add more depth, as an importer, not only is it bad for your consumers that are us as consumers, but you can now talk about firms as consumers. Because if they're placing tariffs on like raw materials, if they're placing tariffs on like, I don't know, computer chips or like steel or whatever it might be, do you guys agree that that's a cost of production for American firms? And if that is the case, which it is the case, what is happening? It's called imported inflation, and it's depicted on the SRAS curve. Let's draw it. So this, that analysis, by the way, we're going to end up with two diagrams. So we could draw in this one paragraph, by the way, yeah? So very quickly, SRAS. What is SRAS? Well, SRAS is impacted by immediate cost factors. So here's real GDP, and this is the price level. Okay, so SRAS is like this. Anything that is an immediate cost factor, like for example, right now, oil prices, do you guys agree that's an immediate cost factor for most firms? In which case, it's going to impact their cost of production right now. SRS would shift, yeah? Raw materials increasing in price, wages going up, the national living wage being introduced. All of these things are immediate cost factors, whereas long run aggregate supply is things like immigration or technology or like population growth, etc. Like that, these are long-term factors that are not going to have an impact on the economy for a long, long time, like education, yeah? Whereas SRAS is like instant, right now. So here's AD, and we go Y1, and we go P1. And what would you say? We just said that the Americans placing tariffs on raw materials and other things like that is really bad for American firms because suddenly now their costs of production are going to go up. SRAS is going to shift inwards. And you get, what you get? You get cost push inflation. Dum dum dum. So that entire paragraph is about how consumers in America are screwed. Yeah, they're way worse off. Allocative efficiency is going to go down. Consumer surplus goes down. There's inflation. Bad. Yeah, it's bad. Like people on fixed incomes, for example, their real wages are going down. It ain't good. Yeah. So that is the analysis, the evaluation. The evaluation could be that it's really good for sunset industries. Now, if it was a developing economy, by the way, I'd be talking about what's it called? Infant industries. Yeah. So my mind blanked. Yeah. Really quickly to just go through the difference. A sunset industry is one that is outdated. It's like very, very stale and old, but it's a massive source of jobs and employment in the economy. And therefore, if there were free trade, these industries would collapse. In America, the US steel industry is very, very old and outdated. It would get decimated by the Chinese, yeah? So what do you want to do? You want to protect that industry because by protecting that industry, you protect jobs. The evaluation is, hey, but you know what? It's going to help protect American firms because there's less competition now. The producer surplus goes up by area A. You can reference the diagram that you drew earlier. Yeah. And also now jobs are protected and you're not going to get unemployment. Thumbs up. So it might be quite good for them. Yeah. Right. Very quickly before I move on to another topic, hopefully that was really clear, is to understand something in terms of the June 2012 paper that really helps. So not 2012, 2021. So 2021. Let's have some Red Bull. Okay, so the extract here was a bit confusing. It was about secondhand clothing in Rwanda, and the question was specifically asking about the impact of tariffs on Rwandan consumers and clothing manufacturers. Okay, The manufacturers hopefully is fairly straightforward because what you do is analysis. You say, hey, it's really good for them because there's now less competition. The consumers might switch away from buying the foreign secondhand clothing and buy more Rwandan secondhand clothing, so their profits are likely to go up. Good, yeah. So for them, from their perspective, it's great. I guess the evaluation there is that even with the tariff, if the quality of foreign producers is better, the PED is inelastic. People are going to continue buying the ones from the foreign competitors and not Rwandan firms if it's still not very good. Even with the tariff, Rwandan clothing manufacturers may be charging a higher price possibly, but like the quality one is a good one, right? So it depends on the PED. In other words, if the PED for the foreign stuff is still inelastic, then it ain't going to impact that much the clothing manufacturers in Rwanda. Yeah, that's the manufacturers. Consumers. Now, the very easy thing to talk about consumers is the tariff diagram. We go consumer surplus goes down by A, B, C, D. Oh my God, disaster, right? That's easy. What's the evaluation? And this is your get out of jail free card. You guys need to understand that within the circular flow of income, consumers are also workers. And therefore, on the Marx scheme, as a valid point is to say it's actually good for workers, though, because less competition means that these firms can hire more of them. It also means that your job is more secure, or it could lead to them hiring more workers, because if there's more demand for Rwandan second-hand clothing, there'll be more demand for labor because labor is derived demand. So it's actually kind of good for the consumers because the consumers here are workers. And that hopefully explains how to answer that. Yeah. All right, let's have a look. What is on my... I've got a long list of things that I've written down that I want to do. Done, 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 done. All right. Trading blocks. Let's deal with the trading blocks. And to start off with, we're going to open the 2020 paper. So October 2020, COVID year. Oh, there we go. Has the following 15 marker. It says, discuss the likely benefits of increased economic integration for sub-Saharan African countries. Okay. So, in a nutshell, they're basically talking in the extract about a trading bloc. It's fairly clear from the extract that it's not a monetary union. I will deal with a monetary union in a moment, but just in terms of like just generically, like a trading bloc, like a single market, like for example, the EU. So they're going to have free trade, there's free movement of labor and capital, and they have a common external tariff. Yeah. How do we answer a question like this? Well, it's a pretty set answer and it's pretty straightforward. So let's start at the beginning. Whenever you're dealing with any topic related to globalization, what is globalization? Globalization is closer integration of countries. Integration, like trading blocks, is globalization. There's free trade, there's more trade. The first thing that you should probably begin with as your first point of analysis is trade creation. So, what is trade creation? Well, trade creation is, hence the name, where there is a higher volume of trade between the countries that are part of the trading bloc, because free trade allows you to fully tap into your comparative advantage. You know what? Let's go on a tangent quickly. What is comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is where you have a lower opportunity cost in the production of a good or service relative to another country. Now, you may be expected to do some maths, basic maths, yeah, and work out the comparative advantage that a country may hold. Let's do it together. And in order for me to actually explain this concept, ignore macro for a second. I'm going to take you through the June 2013 Unit 1 paper, so old spec, where there was a question and it had the following. Let's talk about comparative advantage quickly. So they had bedrooms and they had bathrooms. And the question had two players. It had Bob and Wendy. So here we go. So this was 4 and 2, and this was Bob. And then over here we had 2 and 4. I mean, that's absolutely not to scale, but whatever. Here's 4, and that's 2, and this was Wendy. Okay. Now the question itself wasn't about comparative advantage, but actually the answer was in relation to it. It's about specialization. Yeah. So we're going to now work out together opportunity cost. And I need you to understand how to work out opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is always expressed in terms of the other good. In other words, if I go, what is the opportunity cost of producing a bedroom? My answer must be expressed in terms of bathrooms. And if I was asked to work out the opportunity cost of producing a bathroom, my answer must be expressed in terms of bedrooms. Yeah. Okay. So let's do it in terms of bathrooms. Yeah. So, and let's just pick a player. Let's start with Bob. So here's Bob. And we've got bath over here and bed over here. And then I go, all right, if Bob does nothing but bathrooms, how many bathrooms can Bob make? Well, hopefully you can see the maximum number of bathrooms he's capable of making is 2. So there's 2. And if he did that, well, that means that he's producing no bedrooms whatsoever. He's just doing bathrooms, right? Because that's what his PPF illustrates. So how many bathrooms does he sacrifice? How much does he give up? Well, the answer is 4. Now, I want you to express opportunity cost, especially for comparative advantage questions, in terms of one unit. You go for every one bathroom, how many bedrooms does he give up? So if I make that one, how did I make that become a one? Well, I obviously divided it by two. So do the same thing to the other side. Do we all know what 4 divided by 2 is? Hopefully we all do. It's 2. Yeah? So in other words, for him, for every one bathroom that he makes, he sacrifices, he gives up 2 bedrooms. That's his opportunity cost. All right, let's do the same thing with Wendy. Here's Wendy. Bath, bed. Right, really quickly. If Wendy does nothing but bathrooms, how many bathrooms can she make? Well, she can make 4 bathrooms. How many bedrooms does Wendy give up? She gives up 2 bedrooms. Therefore, for her to make one single bathroom, how many bedrooms, sorry, does she give up? Well, I divided that side by 4. I divide the other side by 4. Hopefully, you know is 0.5. What does that mean in words? It means that for every one bathroom that Wendy makes, she gives up, she sacrifices half a bedroom. Who has a comparative advantage when it comes to bathrooms? Clearly Wendy. Because for Wendy, she gives up less bedrooms for every one bathroom that she makes, yeah? Right. This is why it's important to understand what comparative advantage shows. And I'm going to show you guys a past paper question. We'll do it together, yeah? So, how about these numbers, yeah? Now, obviously, we could have just eyeballed this and said, look, clearly, Wendy should specialize in making bathrooms and Bob should specialize in making bedrooms, yeah? So let's assume they do that. She goes and now makes 4 bathrooms and Bob goes and makes 4 bedrooms. Assuming the monetary value of bathrooms and bedrooms are equal. So imagine they're the same value. What is the logical trade that they should engage in? Do you guys agree the logical trade is that Wendy says to Bob, I'll give you 2 bathrooms, give me 2 bedrooms. And Bob will obviously agree as well, because there's no point in having nothing but bathrooms or nothing but bedrooms. And so what they end up with is an allocation of bathrooms and bedrooms. But watch this. If I go up from 2 to there, do you guys agree it's where that X is? And do you notice something about the X? Do you recognize the fact that that point is beyond both of their PPFs? It was impossible for them to achieve that outcome by themselves. And this is why the theory of comparative advantage is powerful. Because what it shows us is that if you specialize in what you have a comparative advantage in and then you trade, it results in a more efficient allocation of your resources and higher living standards. Does that make sense? That is exceptional. Yeah. Now, really quickly, just to make sure that you understand that. I wasn't planning to do much section A, but let's just do this so that you understand how to do the maths. We go and open the specimen paper. Here we go. There's a question, and it's this. So Colombia and Zambia each produce copper and mineral and emeralds. The production possibility frontier below shows 2 countries' PPFs for these goods. Yeah. And here we are. So we've got Zambia and we've got Colombia. Yeah. Now the first question is almost insulting to your intelligence. Let's quickly whiz through it. Absolute advantage is just simple. It's just simply where you can produce more of a good or service than another country. For example, here, Zambia clearly have an absolute advantage when it comes to copper, and Colombia clearly have an absolute advantage when it comes to emeralds. Yeah. The answer then, because you're not an idiot, is B. Yeah. Zambia has an absolute advantage in the production of copper. Yeah. That's if that took you more than 30 seconds to do, go sit in a corner, think about your life, yeah, and come back to me. Right. The harder question, worth 4 marks, was this. Using appropriate calculations, explain which country has a comparative advantage in the production of emeralds. Right. My method that I showed you a second ago, it is vital that you recognize that whatever you're trying to work out the comparative advantage for is on the left-hand side of the equation. In other words, you want to know for every, in this case, 1 kilogram of emeralds that are being made, how many millions of tons of copper are you giving up? Right. You know what? Can I annotate on this without having to unshare my screen? I think I can. Can I work it out as the other question? That's the I think I can. Oh my God. Hopefully you guys are gonna be able. Oh, I can write. Right. So let's start with Colombia first. Yeah. So Colombia. Hopefully you guys are able to see what I'm writing. Yeah. And remember, I said we need emeralds on one side of the equation and then copper on the other side of the equation. Yeah. Okay. Well, the first thing I say to myself is, if Colombia do nothing but make emeralds, how many emeralds can they make? Well, clearly they can make 1,000 kilograms. Yeah. And how much copper do they give up when they do that? Well, they give up 100 million tons. Yeah. So just do 100. All right. And remember what I said? I said I want to work it out in terms of one. For every 1 kilogram, how much did they sacrifice? I make that into the number one. Yeah. How did I make it into a number one? Well, I divided it by 1,000, obviously. So I now do 100 divided by 1,000, which hopefully, if my maths is not horrendously bad, is 0.1. Yeah. So what did we just work out? Well, we worked out in words just now that for Colombia, for every one, let's move that over there, for every 1 kilogram of emeralds they make, they give up 0.1 million tons of copper. All right. Zambia is much easier. Hopefully you guys can almost like work it out already in your head, but should do it together just to make sure it makes sense. So again, emeralds on one side, copper on the other side. Okay. If Zambia do nothing but emeralds, how many emeralds can they make? Well, they can make 500 kilograms. And how much copper do they give up? Well, they got 500 million tons. And therefore, for one, how did I make it become one? I divided it by 100. Sorry, by 500. Therefore, 500 on the other side divided by 500, crazy maths, yeah, is one. What do we just work out? We just worked out that for Zambia, for every 1 kilogram of emeralds they make, they sacrifice 1 million tons of copper. Who therefore has a comparative advantage when it comes to emeralds? Clearly, it's Colombia, because Colombia sacrificed far less copper. And that's 4 out of 4. Yeah. Hopefully, you guys understand how to answer that now. Let's go back to trading blocks. So, if I go back to trading blocks, I said, look, the starting point is when countries engage in free trade or they remove barriers to trade or become part of a trading bloc, it's easier for them to now tap into their comparative advantage because the whole theory hinges on there being free trade. So now these countries are able to trade whatever it is they specialize in. The extract, by the way, was about the Ivory Coast, and it talks about how the Ivory Coast are a big exporter. They're the biggest exporter in the world of cocoa. So now they can sell a lot more cocoa to all the neighbors that are around them because it's free trade. And you can develop that if you had the time by talking about how, hey, this will lead to export-led growth because exports out of the Ivory Coast are going to go up. X minus M is a component of AD. AD is going to shift out. Exports are also an injection into the circular flow of income, positive, go crazy within the time limit. Yeah. Economic growth goes up. So happy days for you because you joined the trading block. That's our first analysis. Yeah. We could evaluate that. And the evaluation that we can always refer to whenever we're dealing with a trading block is something called trade diversion. So let's understand trade diversion. Right. The opposite of trade creation is trade diversion. Right, let's make sense of it. What is trade diversion? Trade diversion is where trade gets diverted away from more efficient low-cost countries outside of the bloc towards those that are less efficient within the bloc, which sounds really silly, but I can give you the most random of random examples, but it's a real example, yeah? If we go back to the 1970s, so the UK decides to join the EU. I know we've left, yeah, I know the ship has sailed, but just to give you context, yeah? Prior to the UK joining the EU, random example, but we used to buy the majority of our butter from New Zealand. Yeah, so let's just make up numbers. Let's assume that even with transportation costs and everything else included, the butter that we used to buy from New Zealand costs £1. Yeah. Now we join the EU. And what happens now is that because we have free trade with other countries in the EU, like France and Germany and Spain and these guys, there's free trade with them, but there's a common external tariff, meaning that whenever we buy or we import from anywhere outside the EU, those economies, those countries need to pay a tariff. And let's say, for argument's sake, that French butter costs £1 10 pence. So if I have free trade between New Zealand and France, I just buy it from New Zealand because it's obviously cheaper and it's better quality. Now suddenly there's a tariff imposed, not on French butter, they stay at £1 10, but let's say there's a 40p tariff on New Zealand's butter. What happens now? Well, New Zealand's butter now becomes £1 40. And if it becomes £1 40, am I buying it from New Zealand or from France? Well, obviously I'm buying it from France. In other words, being part of a trading bloc may lead to trade diversion, where you divert trade away from less efficient, high cost countries, sorry, from less efficient, my bad, where you divert your trade away from more efficient, low cost countries outside the bloc to less efficient, high cost countries within the bloc, because it distorts the common external tariff, distorts comparative advantage for those who are outside of your bloc. And so actually living standards in your economy might go down. You might end up now paying more, for example, this random example for your butter. Yeah? Does that make sense? That's analysis and that's evaluation. Yeah? Right. Let's wrap up this essay, and then I want to talk to you guys about a really awkward topic and how this will really help to answer that really awkward topic. So that's the analysis number one, and that's the evaluation number one. The second analysis is really straightforward. One of the benefits of being part of a trading bloc is that it's likely to attract higher levels of FDI. TNCs want to set up in regions where there's free trade because then they can sell their goods to neighboring countries, and they want to avoid paying the common external tariff. So in the example over here where the African economies merged, or not merged, but become like a trading bloc, if you're, let's say, a massive company like, I don't know, let's say Apple, it makes sense for you to have headquarters in one of these economies to be able to sell your products to all the neighbors without paying the common external tariff. And we just now talk about FDI. Now, there are a variety of different routes that I can go down when I talk about FDI. I could say investment is a component of AD, AD will shift outwards, injection, multiplier, happy days. I could do that. But you guys recognize the first analysis that we did about trade creation, we started going into exports going up, AD shifting out. It's a bit repetitive. So you can, and you'll get credited, by the way, but let's be a bit different. And the way we're going to be a bit different is to talk about how TNCs, when they set up, especially in developing economies, it is in their interest to improve the infrastructure. Proof in case, June 2023. June 2023 is an extract about Angola. Here we go. And it speaks a lot about how like there are like they really need to upgrade their ports and stuff like that and economic reform. Yeah, here we go. So this it talks about like huge amounts of investment by Chinese firms and how they're basically investing into the like new technology, blah blah blah. Anyways, right? So the point is that it even has like a whole question about like the impact of um improved transport links. Yeah, so that's infrastructure. Yeah, right. The point then is that you can talk about how TNCs are going to come into the economy, and it's in their interest to improve the infrastructure because it makes their business operations smoother. How can I flesh that out? There are two things that I can say. And by the way, this is a really important thing to note. Do not be afraid to talk about micro in macro as long as you don't go too micro. And what I mean by that is, as long as you're not drawing me like a negative externality diagram or you're not drawing me like a cost and revenue diagram, micro and macro interlink. Macro concepts or macro theory is built on micro principles. In which case, if you're talking about like improving infrastructure, by all means, talk about how it means that there's external economies of scale. Do you guys agree that if the roads are improved, it's not just the TNC that accesses the road? All of the domestic firms in Angola or whichever country that we're dealing with now have access to those roads, and therefore their costs are going to go down. Their vehicles are not going to break down as often. Productivity levels are going to go up. They're able to get back and forth more quickly. Yeah. Labor becomes more geographically mobile, right? All of that. And then once you've explained that, you can talk about LRAS shifting outwards and you can draw a very basic diagram to illustrate LRAS shifting outwards. And that, by the way, illustrates two things. It's not just growth, actual and potential, it's also economic development. So if I just quickly draw the diagram, still on a new page, it will look like this. So, oh, hello. Yep, there we go. Right, so real GDP, and this is the price level. And LRAS 1. Draw the AU curve when you're doing LRS shifting out, by the way, like at bottleneck or near full capacity, so you can show both disinflation and economic growth. Here's Y1, here's P1, and then LRS shifting out kind of does that. Okay, so LRAS 2. And this is your diagram. Yeah? Cool. You draw that, you summarize it, you're killing life. Yeah, you're doing amazing. Is that clear? So that's the second analysis. So that FDI, TNCs are more likely to set up because they want to avoid the common external tariff. They want to take advantage of the easy trading conditions that exist here and go develop. Yeah. Right. The evaluation to that is one of two things. But the one I'm going to choose is based off the data, and that's why I'm choosing it because application marks can be earned at any point in the essay. Yeah. Even by the way, if it doesn't say with reference to, I need you guys to be referencing or trying to contextualize it at the very least around the data. And in the 2020 paper, one of the concerns that Nigerian firms had, or like the concerns raised about why maybe joining the trading bloc is not such a good idea, is that countries become too interdependent upon one another. Yeah. So what does that mean? It means that if one of the neighbors, or well, especially a big country, if they are mismanaging their economic affairs, do you guys agree it's very likely to spill over and negatively impact you? And so that's the point. Yeah. So you can draw upon that and say, hey, listen, this is like you're vulnerable to like external shocks outside of your economy spilling over and impacting your economy. The alternative to that is just drawing upon anything that's bad about FDI. Yeah. Let's just go through a couple of bad things about FDI. Number one is when TNCs come and set up in your economy, they are likely to utterly destroy infant industries. What are infant industries? Infant industries, hence why protectionism is a strategy to promote development, by the way, but infant industries are those firms in certain sectors of the economy that are too small at this moment in time to be able to fully tap into the economies of scale that exist. What does that mean? Right, let's go back to some theme 3, yeah? So, I don't know if this is traumatic for you guys or like a good memory for you, but here is an AC curve. You also need to know it for paper 3 anyway. So, here's costs. Here's an AC curve, yeah? Okay, so whatever market this is, yeah, let's say that the domestic firm, because of the fact that they're a very small firm and they're not yet established, they're only selling this many units at this moment in time. Their cost per unit then is all the way up here at C1. A TNC coming into that economy is obviously selling on a global basis, right? They are tapping into crazy levels of economies of scale. They're operating at the MES. And so their cost is significantly lower. They can therefore undercut you so easily in terms of price, you cannot compete against them. And suddenly all of these domestic firms are shutting down and the TNC established itself as a monopoly. That's bad. Yeah. So the TNC could abuse and dominate the market through its monopoly power, but then they can also abuse the workers. Well, they often go to developing economies because Labor laws are normally more relaxed. They'll pay them like ridiculously low wages. They exert themselves as the irony of this from 25 marker and on Monday as a monopoly and a monopsony. They're a monopoly when it comes to selling. They're a monopsony when it comes to buying labor in terms of you have no choice but to accept the wages they're going to dictate to you, and they're going to be some low wages. Yeah? Does that make sense? That is another evaluation that you can draw upon. Last one, the very last thing that we can speak about is the fact that the current account often gets worse when TNCs come over, which sounds a bit weird because current accounts should get better because they should be exporting their goods to neighboring countries. And that does improve it. But quick recap of what the current account is. You know what? Let's go on a quick tangent. The current account is made up of four components. I know that your textbooks might say three, you maybe taught three in school. That's fine. It's not wrong. I just want to zoom in really specifically. So, number one is trade in goods. Okay, what makes a good a good? Well, a good is something that is tangible, something I can actually touch. For example, like a laptop, an orange, a strawberry, a car, right? The UK, by the way, we have a massive deficit when it comes to trading goods. We import way more than what we export. But there are two things that we're pretty good at. One is cars, and the second is pharmaceuticals, yeah, like drugs. We're like the world's drug dealer, yeah? So trading goods, yeah? Just on that point, by the way, one of the reasons why we're pretty good at exporting cars is not necessarily British firms. There are some British firms that are good exporters of cars. But for example, Nissan have a car plant in Sunderland. And I think Toyota also have one maybe in Sheffield or somewhere there. But like the point is that when they make those cars and they sell the cars to like the EU and other countries around the world, that counts as an export for us. Yeah, so that's one, trading goods. Number two, trade in services. Trade in services, right. What is a service? A service is where it's non-tangible, it's like intangible. So like financial services, legal services, yeah? Tutoring services. This is a service called comedy. Thank you very much. Love my jokes. Thank you. Right. But anyway, the point is that this is service. So anyone, for example, that was watching this overseas, if I were being paid for this, I'm not, but if I was being paid for this, that would count as an export for the UK economy. You're all welcome. Yeah. So that's trade in services. Number three, really important to understand, is investment income. Investment income. Right, what is that? Investment income is the financial rewards that you gain for investments made abroad. Right, what does that mean? That means that if I, let's say, buy a flat in Milan, hypothetically, yeah, and I rent out the flat, do you guys agree that money is going from the Italian economy into the UK economy? What does that mean? It means that it's an export earning for the UK. It's an inflow of investment income. Cool? So that's investment income. And then the other alternative, by the way, is if I buy shares in, like, say, an American company like Apple, the purchase of the shares themselves, by the way, are recorded on the financial account. But whenever I get paid dividends, money is going from the USA and it's coming into the UK. So it's an inflow of investment income for us, it's export earnings for us. Yeah. Number four, last one is current transfers. Current transfers is where money is going in or out of the economy, but there's no corresponding good or service. So, for example, remittances, which means that if you work overseas and send money back to your family, money's leaving the economy, but nothing is coming back in return. Yeah. Or international aid. International aid is you're sending money to, let's say, I don't know, Ethiopia. Money leaves the UK economy. You're not expecting to get anything in return. Maybe feel good about yourself. I don't know. Right. But does that make sense? Right. Why is this important? Yeah. The reason why this is important is because of number three, because I need you to understand how it works. If a TNC sets up in a developing economy, typically a lot of the profit is not invested back in that economy. The profit is repatriated. Fancy word. What does that mean? Repatriated means the money is sent back to the home country. So if it's an American company, most of the shareholders are likely to be in the USA. They send the money back. And when they send the money back, what is that? That is an outflow of investment income on their current account. It's like an import. In other words, an outflow of investment income worsens their current account. Yeah. It also contributes, by the way, we'll do this later in economic development, something called capital flight. What is capital flight? Capital flight is the idea that the big institutions like the TNCs, the rich people in the economy, don't keep their money in the banks in that country, which contributes to the savings gap, by the way. I will do that very, very soon. Yeah. But in a nutshell, that is all bad for that economy, and therefore it counts as an evaluation to basically say, hey, listen, it's not so good that the TNC comes and sets up in your economy. Clear? Right. So our analysis was FDI, our evaluation was bad things about FDI, or that they're interdependent, they're too close to get together, yeah? All right, that is how you deal with a trading block that is not a monetary union. A monetary union, though, we go one step further. I need Red Bull. A monetary union, there are a couple of additional points that you can make. Now, bear in mind, trade creation and trade diversion still work. They're still valid. They're very good. But I want to show you guys a few different ones that are more specific and unique to a monetary union. Firstly, what is a monetary union? A monetary union is all of the things that we discussed earlier. So free trade, free movement of labor, free movement of capital, right? Common external tariff, but now they also share a common currency. The Eurozone, as far as I'm aware, is made up now of 21 countries because Bulgaria recently joined, yeah? And so if we've got a question about that, we can deal with it in the following way. Analysis number one. The first analysis and the first benefit to Bulgaria joining the Eurozone is the fact that them having the same currency means that profits for Bulgarian firms are likely to go up. And the reason why they're likely to go up is because now they never need to worry about unfavorable exchange rate movements negatively impacting their profit margins. Let's understand it in very simple terms, yeah? So their currency before they joined the Eurozone was called the lev, yeah? Here's the lev, here's the euro, yeah? Do you guys agree that if suddenly the lev collapses relative to the euro, Bulgarian firms that were selling to other countries in the Eurozone would have really struggled because everything they're exporting is now super cheap and everything they're importing is now super expensive. They're having to pay so much for the like raw materials that they're buying from other Eurozone economies. And now, if that happens overnight and you're not ready for it, what would happen to your firms? They're going to shut down. They're going to basically like collapse, right? So that's really, really problematic. But now, if we no longer use the lev, we use the euro. Can one euro ever be stronger or weaker than another euro? Well, no, it can't, right? In which case, you can now plan ahead with so much conviction and certainty. Yeah. If you're a Bulgarian firm, you go, whatever happens, my currency relative to my main trading partners, who, by the way, are Germany and Italy, is going to be the same all the time. This is why, if you remember earlier, we spoke about why you have a fixed exchange rate. You have a fixed exchange rate for the purposes of trade, to make it easier for your producers to plan ahead with confidence. Well, here now, this is like the ultimate form of a fixed exchange rate because it's the same currency. Yeah. So that is the first part of the analysis that you just develop. There's a little added point as well, is that it eliminates something called transaction costs. What is that? Transaction costs. What's a transaction cost? Well, do you guys agree that whenever you go and let's say sell pounds to get euros, yeah, that there's a middleman, the exchange booth in the airport, for example, do you just think they do it like charitably and they just exchange it at the value in the market? No, they don't. They basically take a commission. And imagine that you are exporting and importing millions of units, right? Before that meant every single time you were importing or exporting, you were having to pay humongous conversion fees, right? You were paying tons and tons in the way of conversion. You don't need to convert anymore, yeah? We're using the euros, yeah? And therefore, we don't need that to do that anymore. That also reduces your cost further. Profits are going to go up. Those profits can be invested. Your firms can become more quality competitive, etc. Yeah, they might achieve export-led growth. There'll be trade creation. Now, don't go crazy because you've grown out of time. But like, that's our first analysis. Yeah, that is excellent analysis. Second analysis, I'll deal with evaluations in a second. The second analysis, I did it already, which is that it is clearly attractive for FDI. TNCs want to set up in areas where there's free movement of labor, free trade, etc. Yeah. Within that point, by the way, about the firm, I also could have mentioned managerial economies of scale. Free movement of labor will allow you to attract the most talented workers, or financial economies of scale. Again, I know this is micro. You can incorporate it into the overarching point, or in the body, sorry, yeah? Why? Because if you're now a Bulgarian firm and you go to the bank and you go, hey, we want a loan, they're probably going to give you a bigger loan than they would have been willing to give you before and at a lower interest rate than before because you know that scenario that I played out a second ago where the left collapses relative to you, it can't happen now. And therefore, you're more trustworthy. So you can take out big loans at lower interest rates and do that. But anyways, second analysis, FDI. TNCs will love being part of a monetary union. The best example to give is Ireland, yeah? And I want to show you that from an extract. Ireland, partly because their corporation tax rates are very low. They actually raised it, by the way. I think a year ago, I read an AQA paper. I think it used to be 12.5%. I think it's like 15% now, but still very low. But if we go and read June 2016. Right, hopefully you guys are okay. Yeah, how you doing? Well, the massive Red Bull can is running out. But it's all good. We'll keep going. So in the old spec, they had a choice to do two data response. Here's the one I want to look at. Ireland, right, extract two. Look at this, yeah? It talks about how much FDI Ireland have achieved or have received, yeah? And it gives examples of like firms that have set up within Ireland as well. I'm trying to find, oh, there we go, yeah? The country, by the way, I don't even understand how the maths works here. Like, one of you guys is probably smarter than I am mathematically. It says the country has an export to GDP ratio of 108%. the actual hell? Right? How? But anyways, whatever. Compared to 30% for Italy. Irish exports rose 12% between 2013 and 2014. So remember the earlier example I said, which is that Nissan, when they make their cars in the UK and then they sell it overseas, that's an export for us. Ireland have had so much FDI that their export to GDP ratio is 108%. How? I don't know, but we're going to accept it, yeah? And then it goes. Ireland's biggest export earners are Google, Microsoft, Johnson and Johnson, Pfizer. Whoa, yeah? Make sense? So you can now basically allude to that and go, hey, being part of the Eurozone might be a good idea. Bulgaria might see more TNC setting up. They might decide to have operations there because they can trade and sell and blah, 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 blah. That's analysis. Let's evaluate because evaluations are sensational for this. The go-to evaluation, and I cannot emphasize enough. If they ask you guys a 15 or a 25 marker on joining a monetary union, the good and bad things about it, you're going to remember my voice in the exam and you're going to say to yourself, thank you, because you're going to write about this. And you're going to write about how one of the biggest problems of being part of the Eurozone is, in fact, not one of the biggest problem, is the loss of monetary independence. What does that mean? In the Eurozone, there are 21 countries. How many central banks are there? There is one single central bank, the European Central Bank, and they therefore have to set a base rate, an interest rate that needs to work for 21 countries. How's that panned out? Not well is very much the answer. And the logic of why is that if you end up in a situation where one economy, this is exactly what happened about 5, 6 years ago, the German economy was booming, it was doing really well, while the Greek economy was in a deep, deep recession. What does that mean? If you have an economy that's booming, if I just quickly draw it out, right? One of the problems of like rapid economic growth is that you get tons of inflation, right? So what kind of interest rate would Germany need? Well, Germany need a high interest rate to encourage people to save and spend less, to shift AD inwards and relieve the economy of some of the inflationary pressure that's built up, right? Greece, on the other hand, is somewhere over here, like dying, right? Their economy is in like massive recession, right? What do they need? Well, they need a low interest rate. And if they have, therefore, one central bank, how can that central bank cater to both countries' needs? The answer is they can't. They cannot cater to both countries' needs. And that is a massive, massive problem. Yeah. That is the best evaluation by an absolute mile. And I need you to do it if it comes up in terms of monetary union. Yeah. That's number one. Number two, second evaluation is to talk about interdependency again, how it's not a good idea to be too interdependent upon one another. And you can point to the fact that many Eurozone economies have had to have bailouts at certain points in time. Yeah. They have a very mean acronym for them, and they were called the PIGS. So PIGS stands for Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain. They all at one point in time had to get bailed out. Their economies, their debt reached such like unhindered levels that they had to get bailed out by other Eurozone economies. Germany contributed something like 56 billion euros towards the bailout of the Greek government. France contributed 42 billion, etc., etc. So, anyways, in a nutshell, you go, hey, look, it's not a good idea to be this interdependent, yeah? And then finally, the last thing that we could talk about is the fact that actually not being able to manipulate your exchange rate may not be such a good thing. Because there are moments, like, for example, Brazil, the 2024 paper, where you might want to make your currency weaker relative to your main trading partners. You might want to intervene in the market and devalue your currency. Can you devalue your currency if you're part of the Eurozone? No, you can't, right? And that means that you may not have the flexibility that other countries have when it comes to your exchange rate. Is that really clear? Last thing, and then we'll move on to something else. If I now look at the 2012 paper, let's work it out. Yeah, oh, it was in the right place. Right, June 2012 actually leads me quite nicely into the next topic. Had the following question. So, very quickly, Ted Marker says, assess possible reasons why the GDP of European Union countries, sorry, outside the Eurozone grew at a faster rate than the Eurozone average in the first 9 months of 2010. This is where you take the skills that you've just developed and just amend it to answer that question. So what are we actually basically doing here? Well, we're providing reasons. Now, the key word here is possible reasons, yeah? Meaning that you can make it up as long as it's theoretically sound, yeah? So you can go, one possible reason why countries outside the Eurozone may have grown at a faster rate than Eurozone economies is monetary independence. Do you guys agree that countries, I mean, we were in the EU at the time, so countries such as the UK may have set a lower interest rate than the Eurozone? And if interest rates are really low in the UK, people will be saving less and consuming more. AD would have shifted out. Economic growth would have happened. Cool. Can countries in the Eurozone set their own interest rates? No, they cannot, right? That is the first analysis then, right? Another reason potentially for why countries outside the Eurozone may have experienced more rapid growth is it could have been that the pound depreciated relative to the euro. Can the euro depreciate relative to another euro? No, it can't. Therefore, those countries that do most of their trade with each other never have the advantage of becoming more price competitive, specifically in terms of their exchange rate. There are other ways to become price competitive, like inflation rate, how productive your workforce is, your quality competitiveness, that. But in terms of your exchange rate, you can never be more price competitive compared to another eurozone economy. Yeah. So again, it could be, oh, maybe the pound depreciated relative to the euro, and that would have made us more price competitive. Exports might have gone up, AD might have shifted outwards, and that can help explain why economic growth was rapid, or not rapid, but like faster in the UK relative to the eurozone economies. The evaluation, a clever evaluation, if you're ever stuck, is to look at the wording, and the wording there says average. Average could be dragged down by like one or two really, really underperforming economies. And actually, if you read the extract here, it speaks about how Germany's economy is growing more rapidly than the UK. It was doing much better than us, right? So you can basically like, yeah, not all economies in the Eurozone were suffering. Some economies doing amazingly well. So it's not true that they all had like slow growth, yeah? Hopefully that's clear. And those are the kind of things that you would be looking for. Yeah. Again, also you can question, like, as in if you'd set the paper at the time, you would have known that the Eurozone interest rate was as low, if not lower than the UK. So that's probably not the reason then. It can't be that low interest rates are causing higher growth in one place and not in another place. Okay, right. If you get a question like this 12 marker, and this 12 marker I did in my live in 2023. And to be clear, I promise it's not a prediction, nor am I saying that I know what comes up. I don't. And hopefully you saw from the paper one live, if you prepare properly, nothing is surprising to you. If you prepare by going through past papers, you basically have seen your exam. Yeah. That year, 2023, I went through this in my live. And guess what? The 2023 25 marker was literally this as a 25 and about the UK. It says, examine policies which might improve the competitiveness of the goods and services produced by Greece, Italy, and Portugal. This is what I want you to always do. If you get a question about competitiveness, what does that firstly mean? Competitiveness is basically whether you're price competitive or quality competitive or both, yeah? I need you to always, from now on, promise me that you're going to answer this entirely as a supply side policy essay. Do all of it as supply side policy. Don't do anything else. I don't want anything else. I don't want you to devalue the currency. I don't want you to do any. Do you know why? Because yeah, I agree that devaluing the currency makes you more price competitive. Valid, right? But the problem is that you end up being tempted to start talking about the impact on the current account. That is not the question. The question is not, oh, what does that do to the current account? And then if you start evaluating with things like, oh, Marshall Lerner, J curve. None of that is relevant to this question. If it was how to improve the current account, yeah, 100% that's what I want you to do. But here is specifically competitiveness. Number one, education and training. Let's do it. So, share my screen. And this will help us with a lot of topics, actually. Education and training is like so clutch. Right. So our first supply side policy that I want us to basically address is investment into education and training programs. And there are really important ways that you can develop this. And remember that education and training is really great because it answers a variety of questions. So if I was dealing with like how to, let's say, achieve economic development or let's say like reducing unemployment, I could speak about how it could fix things like structural unemployment. What is structural unemployment? It's where certain people's skills have become outdated. And so I can retrain them to get skills that are more relevant to the economy, right? Well, here, the key things that I want to mention, I can mention that, by the way, that's still part of the depth. I can say, hey, they can invest into education and training programs that can address issues like structural unemployment, equip people with the skills necessary for the economy. That's good. But then I can mention some cool buzzwords. One of them is something called human capital. What does that mean? Human capital is a really, really fancy way of describing workers as if they're machines. So the level of human capital goes up. Productivity levels in the economy go up. Unit labor costs. Right, what is that? That's a very important concept. Unit labor cost is the cost of each worker relative to the output the worker produces. Right, can I explain that in really simple maths? Imagine you pay a worker £10 and that worker produces 10 units. You then pay another worker £1,000 and that worker produces 10,000 units. Which one has a lower unit labor cost? Well, the answer is this guy. Because even though you're paying them a higher salary, the amount of output they produce on a kind of unit basis is much, much lower. You therefore want your unit labor cost to be as low as possible, because if they're as low as possible and you're as efficient as possible, you're going to become more price competitive. Yeah, does that make sense? And actually, if I look at the data, it talks about it. Look at the data in the exact paper that we're looking at over here. Look at figure 2. No, not figure 2. Figure 4. There we go. Figure 4. It shows Unit labor costs in selected Eurozone countries, and look at who's at the bottom. Germany. Does that mean the German workers get paid less than Greek workers? No, it does not. It means that German workers, despite the fact that realistically they get paid much more than Greek workers, are so efficient. They're so productive that the cost per unit is still lower. Does that make sense? So you can describe unit labor costs going down, right? But then let's flesh it out a little bit more. But it's a 12 marker, so not for a 12, more for a 25 marker. What I can also talk about is that a more educated workforce is more capable of technological breakthroughs and innovation. And if I have more technological breakthroughs and innovation, I also become more quality competitive. Am I answering the question? Of course, I'm answering the question because we talked about how they're more price competitive and they're now more quality competitive as well. You can draw the LRAS curve shifting out and you'll see disinflation happening, by the way, adds to the point about them becoming more price competitive. It's analysis. The evaluation to that is time lag. It takes ages. This is not a quick fix, especially if you're dealing with like high skilled labor. To be able to develop high skills, it takes a long, long time. And therefore, this is not going to address the immediate concerns of the economy and it's not going to make them more competitive right now. Yeah. That's the analysis and the evaluation. Second analysis, you have a choice in terms of supply side policies. The one that I probably would do is reduce corporation tax. Because if you reduce corporation tax, two things happen. Number one, firms in your economy, so let's say if like Spain reduces their corporation tax, they keep more of their profits and therefore they can invest into new technology. Does that make them more quality competitive? Yes, it does. If they invest into technology that reduces how much time it takes to manufacture goods or how efficient their production process becomes, do they become more price competitive? Yes, it does. Are we answering the question? Yes, we are. And then we can also say, hey, look, if you have low corporation tax, it's also going to attract FDI. Who can we allude to? Ireland. Ireland, we know, has low corporation tax. And who is an island? Google's an island. Microsoft is an island. Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson, Diddy. I'm joking, no, right? So the point is that all of these countries that have low corporation taxes are going to get more. Well, if you get low corporation tax, you're going to basically get an influx of FDI. And then that means the TNC comes over and brings their technology to your economy. Make sense? That improves your competitiveness as well. Eval. The evaluation, you could do one of two things. One is there is no guarantee that firms are going to actually invest the extra profits. They could simply pay out more dividends to their shareholders, right? Two, if your corporation tax is low, but another country has even lower corporation tax, TNCs might not set up in your country, they'll go somewhere else, right? And number three is that actually, again, there's a time lag, but I probably wouldn't do time lag again. That's a bit lame. So let's not do that. I'm trying to think of better evaluation of that. You can also talk about the fiscal deficit being really high. The government collect less tax revenue now, so fiscal deficit goes up, national debt goes up, and I will deal with that later when we do like the impact of fiscal deficits and national debt if we get a chance. Yeah. Okay, competitiveness done and hopefully really easy. I want to deal with an absolutely vulgar question, which if I had the choice, I would avoid. If this is a 25 marker, you go, no thanks, that's not for me. But in case it's in a data response and you've got no choice, let's deal with it together. And it is from June 2019. Okay. For those of you on the chat that are asking what time this ends, the only person, I don't know. No one knows. Yeah. You don't know. I don't know. Let's see how much I can keep going for. I'm dying, but like I will keep going as much as I can for you guys. Um, we'll see. Let's just keep going. All right. So 2019 has a question which is very much disgusting. Number seven. It says, three of Africa's main trading blocs have agreed to form the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement, TFTA. This will create one of the world's largest free trade areas, stretching across 26 countries with a combined GDP of around 1 trillion pounds. Cool. And then you're like, oh, it's going to be about trading blocks. That's kind of nice. And then you read the question and go, okay, I'll do number eight. Evaluate the effects of the growth of trading blocks, such as the TFTA, on global trading patterns. Okay, let's discuss what that even means. What are global trading patterns? What is the pattern of trade? The pattern of trade is just a really fancy way of saying where things are going from one country to another. In other words, like where are you buying your products from? How much trade are you doing with one country over another country, etc., etc., etc. Yeah. So what we did earlier today is going to be very, very helpful here. And bear in mind, I really would not do this as a 25. I feel like developing this in meaningful detail is very difficult. So this is the wrong option. But in case it's a 12 or a 10 or a 15, let's understand how we deal with it. The first thing that you could talk about is that when you join a trading bloc, it's likely to result in trade diversion. That you start to divert your trade away from countries outside of the bloc to those inside the bloc. The example I gave you earlier with the New Zealand and butter, it distorts comparative advantage for countries who are outside of the bloc. Agreed? And so suddenly now those in the bloc look more attractive, but it's all artificial. It's only more attractive because of the fact that those outside the bloc are paying the common external tariff, right? So that's the analysis. You could talk about that. Now, what I could evaluate with is it depends, though. It depends because even with the tariff, the country that you bought your goods from before, like you imported from, they might still have a comparative advantage. And often, comparative advantage, by the way, is natural climate. So if I look at the 2020 paper really quickly about oh, I lost it. About the Ivory Coast, yeah? The Ivory Coast, you can see that 54% of their exports there are in cocoa beans and cocoa products. Right. Why? The logic is do you guys agree that they have a comparative advantage in cocoa because they have the exact right climate to grow the cocoa? In the same way that Brazil have the right climate for coffee beans and soya beans and things like that. Italy have the right climate for like olives, etc. Yeah. So the point then is you go, even with the tariff in place, and even when countries join a trading bloc, trade may not be diverted away from certain countries. The pattern of trade remains as it was before, where you continue to import. Because if you want cocoa, you have nowhere else really to buy the cocoa but from the Ivory Coast. They're the biggest exporter of cocoa in the world. Yeah. That's one half of the essay. The other half of the essay is now go, okay, it's going to obviously lead to trade creation. A lot more trade is going to be conducted between the member states within the bloc. Because of the fact that there's free trade, they can now tap into their comparative advantage. They can now specialize. They can each do something that, like they're really good at. And as a result, there's going to be higher trade creation. So again, the pattern of trade now is focused within the bloc. There's a lot more activity and trade taking place within that bloc. Evaluation, in honesty, it's not amazing, but like it's not an amazing essay. The marks you might have better points, but like you guys can go run through it. But the evaluation that you could potentially talk about is that the amount of trade creation that happens will depend on how many countries there are in the bloc and how good, like logistically, the kind of infrastructure is. If it's very difficult to trade, like, and it takes a long time, and like, a lot of them are landlocked and blah, 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 then maybe it doesn't actually result in that much trade in that economy. And also, if there's only a few of them in the economy, then that's not really going to have a transformative effect in terms of the impact on trade. Yeah. Just as an example, if I look at the specimen paper, the data response, I'll start closing these tabs before my thing starts to go really slow. It was about these guys, Monotrinian, yeah? I think it was like 6 countries or something like that. Like it wasn't some massive trading block that they were establishing there. And so you can go, look, if it's only a small trading block, it's not going to have such a big impact. Whereas a big trading block like the EU, yeah, there's going to be a lot of trade being conducted within the EU rather than, like a small trading block. Again, I know that's not an incredible evaluation, but it's not an incredible essay. Yeah. All right. You know what? Just because I actually saw this question randomly, lucky you guys. Let's just quickly deal with this weird question. So it says, um, with reference to figure one, discuss the use of GDP data as a means of comparing living standards among the 5 EAC member countries. Oh, there you go, 5. Yeah. Okay. You could get a question like this about the problems basically of using GDP, which is a theme two concept. Yeah. Let's run through the 2 bad things about GDP that you should always be speaking about, and then I'll tell you the evaluation that would always work. So let's start closing some tabs so that the laptop doesn't start playing up like last time. Right. Okay. Right. So let's go back to my board and discuss. Okay. Imagine that you and I are on an island. That's the wrong thing to say, to be honest with you guys. Not an island, not that kind of island, right? We're an economy. Yeah. Jeez. Right. So we are an economy, and in that economy, you earn £1 billion a year. Wow. Go you. Yeah. I earn £1 a year. Okay. If you look at our GDP or our GDP per capita, our GDP, by the way, is 1 billion plus one, so 1 billion and one. Or if we divide it by two, whatever the maths is, like half a billion and 50p. Right. You look at that economy and you basically go, wow, the living standards in that economy are wow, incredible, right? Is that true? No, it is not, right? Because you guys are living a lavish lifestyle. I am in deep poverty, right? And so it doesn't factor in income inequality, right? So the GDP figure may not be a true reflection of living standards, and it's a bad metric because of the fact that you could have certain economies where the vast majority of the GDP figure is accounted for by a teeny tiny percentage of the population. India is a very good example of this, yeah, where there's huge levels of inequality. So it's not really a very good indicator of living standards for the average person. That's number one. Number two, you have a choice. You can combine them together as well. There's something called subsistence farming, if I can spell it right. We're going to pretend that's how you spell it. I'm probably butchering the spelling, but we'll go with that. What is that? Subsistence farming is the idea that the farmers, the crops they grow, they consume themselves. They don't sell it to the market. Now, the thing is that that is output. So as part of GDP, it should be measured. GDP is meant to measure the total value of all the output we produce in an economy in a year. But if you've got a lot of subsistence farming, the GDP figure is very undervalued. It's not a true reflection of living standards in the economy because a lot of the output that's being produced is not being sold, it's being eaten. Yeah. So that's a problem. Within that, you can also talk about the hidden economy. Yeah. The hidden economy, illegal activity that takes place. Well, obviously, those transactions are not being recorded as part of GDP for very obvious reasons because it's illegal. But again, that should have been part of GDP. But once again, it's not being recorded as part of GDP, so it's undervaluing the true living standards in that economy. Easy peasy. That is the analysis always. Yeah, those are your two go-to. Yeah, easy peasy. Evaluation is to defend GDP and to say that there are a couple of things about GDP that are actually quite good. Number one is the data is very easy to collect, which is why most countries in the world do release GDP figures, and therefore we have a metric to compare one country to the next. And the other thing is that whilst there are obviously anomalies here and there is clearly a correlation between higher living standards and GDP. Like they are correlated. So therefore you can go, no, it's like the best kind of that we have. It's not bad. Yeah. Does that make sense? So that's how you answer a question like that. Right. What's left on my list? All right, let's take a deep breath and let's do something massive. Let's go and do economic development. Are we ready? Economic development is lovely because economic development is split down the middle between two parts. One is the limitations to economic development, like the constraints to economic development. And the other side is the strategies to promote economic development. I'll do as many as I can, but I just want to give you guys enough for you to go into the exam and write confidently. Yeah. This was last year's 25 marker, by the way, but that's not to say it can't come up again. And in case you're revising like an idiot and go, oh, it came up last year, it can't come up. Just as a reference point, last year's 15 marker, supply side policies. The year before 15 marker, supply side policies. Do not assume that something that has come up a year ago can't come up again. It definitely can. Yeah. Does that make sense? June 2024, 25 marker was about contestability. June 2025, 10 marker, contestability in your face. Yeah. Anyways, right. The point is this. So, the first limitation to economic development that I want you to understand is something called the Harrod-Domar model, savings gap. So Harrod-Domar model, savings gap. Okay, and let's make sense of the savings gap. So, in a nutshell, in developing economies, the savings rate tends to be very, very low. People don't save very much. And part of the reason why it's so low is that the GDP per capita, so the average earnings of people in that economy, are also very, very low. Yeah. And therefore, they have very limited amount of money to save to begin with. Yeah. So they have a very high, what we call marginal propensity to consume. Right. I referenced that concept earlier. Marginal, if you remember, one more unit. Propensity to means for every additional unit of income you earn, how much of it do you consume? So let's assume hypothetically you earn $2 in a day. Yeah. And hypothetically, your income now goes up to, let's say, $2 or 50 cents. Yeah. Right. Are you realistically going to use the extra 50 cents and save any of it? Or are you going to basically like use the entire amount to just buy basic necessities? Obviously, you're going to pay for basic necessities. You need to live, like food and water and like clothing, right? So does that make sense? That means that the savings rate is very low. Now, the problem then that kind of makes this even worse is that banks don't have the incentive to set up in countries where savings are low. Because how do banks make their money? Do you remember earlier I said that when you deposit money in a bank account, they lend it out and they grow their money that way? Well, if no one's saving or very few people are saving, banks don't have the incentive to set up. That means even the individual in the economy that have the means to save. So let's say you have the money to save. Imagine if you had to walk for like 3 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles to get to a bank. Are you likely to do that on a regular basis? Probably not. Therefore, the savings rate is very, very low. And why are savings necessary? Savings are needed because when banks have money in their accounts in the form of savings, they can lend out to businesses. One of the main ways that we achieve growth and development is by investment, investing into new technology. And so the problem is this: low savings equals low borrowing or lending, right? Low investment, low capital accumulation. Fancy way of basically explaining the rate at which the capital stock is increasing, and therefore low economic developments. That is the savings gap. So all of it stems around lack of savings means that banks are either not there or those that are there have very little amount of money to lend out. Businesses therefore borrow very little amount of money, and the amount they borrow is often with really high interest rates. And this all translates into low savings, low investment, and low economic growth and development. That's the analysis. Yeah. Let's evaluate. There are two evaluations. Number one, a lot of these countries now receive aid, meaning that it's not as big a deal as it used to be. If you get international aid, like for example, if you get, I don't know, like food parcels or something like that, or clothing, right? Do you guys agree that you don't need to spend all of your limited amount of income now on basic necessities? You can actually save more easily. Yeah. In fact, if you look at the paper 3, June 2018, question 2C, it's about Indonesia and the benefits of aid to Indonesia. That could have been one of your points, is that it helps to fill the savings gap. Because now Indonesians don't need to spend all their like limited income on basic necessities, they're getting given aid, right? So that's the evaluation. Within that, another one, really good one. It actually is referenced, there's good data to read, is from the June 2013 paper. It's all about technology taking off in Africa. Yeah. Technology is really useful to basically evaluate the savings gap with, because do you guys agree that it is far easier to save now than it would have been about 20, 30 years ago? Why? Because before, for me to save, I would have had to lug large sums of cash from wherever I live to the bank. And remember, the bank is like pretty far away. What can I now do? Technology allows me to take digital transfers. I can now buy a card reader as, let's say, I have like a fruit stand. And if I accept a digital payments, do we agree that that means that money is wired straight into my account? It makes it far easier for me to save. That's the savings rate. Does that make sense? That's number one. Yeah. I'm going to do like just two more and then we'll move on to the other side of this. The second one is the foreign exchange gap. So again, Harodoma. So Harodoma model. And now it's the FX gap. All right, let's get some water. Okay. So the Harodoma model, foreign exchange gap, right? You guys know from earlier in the live that we spoke about what foreign reserves are. Foreign reserves are simply any other currency in your economy. And a lot of developing countries struggle because they have very limited amounts of foreign reserves. Now, this is a really big problem. The reason why it's a really big problem is obviously they can't manipulate their exchange rate, but actually an even bigger problem is to do with trade. If I look at their terms of trade, let's again go on a tangent and understand what terms of trade are. Terms of trade is the price index of exports divided by the price index of imports in times it by 100, right? Can I explain this in really simple terms? Yeah. It just simply means the monetary value of what you're selling to the world versus the monetary value of what you are purchasing from the world. Yeah. It is not about the quantity. It's just imagine you sold one unit and you bought one unit. That is your terms of trade. Yeah. Now, what does that actually mean in the context of this? Yeah. If your currency is really, really weak. So let's say, like in the June 2016 paper, the Ghanaian currency, the CD, depreciates. Okay. Do you guys agree that that means that Ghanaian firms, everything they're exporting to the world is now cheaper, right? And crucially, the really, really bad thing is that everything they're importing is now really expensive, yeah? So mathematically, by the way, if this is going down because it's becoming cheaper and this is going up, can we see what's happening to the overall number? Well, the overall number is going down because this going down pushes the number down. Yeah. The bottom of the fraction going up pushes the number down further. Yeah. So the terms of trade are really weak for economies where their currency is weak relative to like a developed economy. Right. What does that mean in simple terms? Imagine that you live in Ghana or you're a Ghanaian firm and you want to import capital machinery to develop your business. You want like, I don't know, the latest state of the art technology. Yeah. If your currency is super duper weak, it's going to require you to sell more and more of your weak currency to buy $1, to buy €1. And so imports are so expensive for you that realistically you struggle to import. Whereas if we had a large stock of foreign reserves, if I just had loads of dollars and loads of euros, it doesn't matter if my currency is weak relative to the euro or the dollar. I can just immediately use my euros and dollars to import. So the lack of foreign reserves is an issue, right? That's the first problem. The second problem that they have is that very often debt is quoted in international currencies like dollars. Yeah. And again, if your currency gets weaker, that means that you need to sell more SEDI to be able to buy $1. Yeah. In fact, sorry, I know I keep going on tangents. I'm going to show you guys how this all interconnects. Paper 3, October 2020. Let's go look at it. Watch. Turkey time. Right. Turkey. Here we go. Oh, I went past that there. A marker. The A marker says examine two reasons why the Turkish government may want to avoid a significant fall in the exchange rate of the Turkish lira. There is one line in the extract that I want to draw your attention to. In extract A, it says the following. It says this. Turkey is highly indebted in foreign currency. What does that mean? If your currency gets weaker and you don't have many foreign reserves, whenever your currency gets weaker relative to, let's say, the US dollar, do you guys agree that that means that you need to sell more lira in order for you to buy $1? The real value of your debt is therefore going up. Does that make sense? In other words, countries that have limited foreign reserves, not only do they struggle to import to grow and develop their economy, but the real value of their debt is increasing whenever their currency depreciates. And that is often the case, by the way. Yeah. Their currency relative to like the US dollar is often weaker. Because imagine this way, right? So imagine this is like the SETI, this is the dollar. Even if it stays as it is, but the dollar appreciates, that means that relatively speaking, this is depreciated. Does that make sense? Yeah. And often, by the way, because a lot more hot money flows into the USA, a lot more hot money will flow into like the Eurozone than it would do in Ghana. And so currencies typically are getting like disparities getting wider, usually. Yeah. So that's the crux of the point, is that the Haradoma model says, look, these guys lack the foreign reserves to grow and develop their economy because they just struggle to import the technology they need to develop their economy. Yeah. Last one. Oh, sorry, we need to evaluate that. Two evaluations. The first evaluation is tourism. Tourism can help fix this problem. If you have a lot of people visiting your economy, those people would have to bring their foreign currency to buy goods and services in your economy. They'll sell their foreign currency to buy your currency. And tourism is a great way to fix this problem more. Yeah. The other one is debt relief. If you get debt relief, well, it means that you don't have to use up whatever foreign reserves that you have towards paying the debts. You can now use your foreign reserves instead to do what? To go and import capital machinery. Sorry, I know I keep going on tangents. It's probably very annoying. I just want to show you because I remembered it. 2023. Angola again. Look at the 10 marker. I think it's 10 marker. Yeah, it is. Assess two likely benefits of debt relief to Angola. One is really easy. One is the government now have more money left over that they don't need to pay towards debts. They can instead invest into areas like education, healthcare. So that's pretty straightforward, yeah. Two, the second benefit of debt relief, it helps to fill the foreign exchange gap. Because now the limited foreign reserves that Angola have no longer need to go towards servicing, basically paying off their debts. Instead, they can now use it to import capital, machinery, and technology. Make sense? That's the second analysis. That's really sophisticated and high level, yeah? Okay, right. Let's go back and do a third limitation to growth and development over here. Number three is massive. Number three is something called primary product dependency. So primary product dependency. Right. If you're lucky enough that you get this as a 12 or a 15, lucky you. Yeah. There are two key analyses that I want us to address. The first is that what is a prime product? A prime product is anything that is sourced from the earth, anything that is naturally grown. So there are another name for prime product is a commodity. There are soft commodities and there are hard commodities. Soft commodities are things like agricultural products like cocoa, I don't know, wheat, barley, etc. Yeah. And then hard commodities are like the metals, so diamonds, copper, gold, etc. Yeah. Now, if you look at the price of commodities over time, they often look like this. QP. They're very, very, very volatile. Right. Why are they so volatile? Well, the reason why they're so volatile is that they are very vulnerable to external shocks, such as like weather conditions. So if there's like a really good harvest, that means that there's an abundance of, let's say, cocoa, and so the price is really, really low, like down here. Yeah. Now, the extract I showed you earlier from 2020, it shows that 54% of exports out of the Ivory Coast are cocoa. Now, think about it. If the price of cocoa collapses due to, let's say, a good harvest, naturally demand is going to go up, right? Because whenever prices fall, demand goes up. Sure, yeah. The thing though is that think about from the perspective of like, just logic, are commodities, agricultural products in particular, elastic or inelastic in demand? But the answer is they are inelastic in demand, right? The PED is inelastic. Why? Because if the price of cocoa goes down, it's not like we're going to dramatically increase how much cocoa we buy. So therefore, there's a less than proportionate rise in demand, right? If I do it in terms of my arrows, that means that the reduction in the price is going to be greater than how much demand goes up by. Demand goes up, it goes up, but only goes up a little bit. So I'm going to put another arrow next to price. So what happens to total revenue? Total revenue goes down. Does that make sense? In other words, your farmer's revenue is going to collapse. And if that's the main source of employment, unemployment's skyrocketing. If that's the main source of government tax revenue is on the floor. If it's the main export, your current account is much worse. Yeah. Economic growth rates are falling. Make sense? That's your first analysis. You go, hey, this is a disaster. When the price collapses, not good. Yeah. You can, if it was like a 25 market, to develop it in even more detail, go talk about the other end, where if, for example, let's say demand had risen and there's a higher price. The problem is that the PES for products like cocoa are inelastic. What does that mean? It means that it's going to take a long time for your cocoa farmers to grow more cocoa. The average harvest for a cocoa tree is 5 years. How do I know that? June 2000 and actually I remember what year it is. I think June 2012 or 2011. Unit 1, old spec. Anyways, yeah. So data response. That's where you get your real world knowledge from. So PS is inelastic, so they can't actually scale up their production and make that much more money. That's your analysis, yeah. Now that volatility, to wrap it up, makes it very difficult for you to plan ahead with any meaningful conviction. You don't know whether it's going to be a good or bad harvest, and therefore you're realistically going to like reduce or you're not going to invest very much, yeah. That is our analysis. Now, the evaluation, we could do one of two things. We can either do a buffer stock scheme, but I probably wouldn't, by the way, because it will take too long to explain it and draw the diagram. They asked the 12 marker about it last year. Go watch my video on buffer stock schemes to save time. I've done a whole video on it. I've gone through what it is. I've drawn the diagram for you, but like to save time, go watch it. But the alternative, and the one that I probably would do, is something called forward markets. So what are forward markets? Well, a forward market is where you as a producer, in this case like a farmer, will agree to sell your cocoa for a fixed price in the future. And you're guaranteed to get that price regardless of what happens to the market price. So if you've locked in a price of, let's say, $3 per kilogram for your cocoa, whatever happens, you're going to get $3. No matter what the market price is at that point, you're getting $3, yeah? Which is really helpful in volatile markets like this because it allows you to plan ahead with a lot more conviction. The other market where they do this, by the way, is foreign exchange. Because again, that's really volatile. And remember how we spoke about how if you're an exporter or an importer, the worst thing that can happen is overnight your currency just collapses. Because suddenly now everything that you're selling is cheaper and everything you buy is really expensive. If I then take you very quickly to June 2019, June 2019, here we go. Question 6A. Look at that. Oh, went past. With reference to extract A, explain the role of forward markets in currencies. Literally that. Yeah, you explain what it is. And obviously from the perspective of the exporter has a whole extract, by the way, about like some guy who sells loads, Norfolk-based picture frame, blah, whatever his name is, yeah? So he fixes the exchange rate in advance, and therefore no matter what happens in the pound relative to, let's say, the US dollar or the EU, I think it was the EU, the Eurozone, like the euro, it's locked in. So you're good. You can plan ahead around that. Is that clear? All right, cool. That is our first analysis, first prime product dependency issue and the evaluation to it. Right, let's do another one. The other one is something called Prebisch-Singer. And this is how Prebisch-Singer works. Prebisch-Singer says that countries that export primary products will be able to import less and less for any given level of exports over time. Right, why? It's because the YED for primary products compared to manufactured goods tend to be far more elastic, so greater than one, compared to commodities, yeah, like primary products. Usually, yeah? And especially, by the way, food, right? Let me explain that in really simple terms. Imagine that your income goes up. So let's say you earn an extra 20%. Are you going to dramatically increase how much food you're going to eat? Probably not, right? You might switch to like higher quality food. You might eat more, I don't know, right? But you're not going to go mental and double the amount of food that you eat. You're not going to go to like a drive-through and ask for like double burgers and double chips and double everything, yeah? I need double Red Bull to be honest, but like, yeah, the point is that it's not that it's inelastic. Whereas think about manufactured goods, things like laptops, a car, a phone, right? If you go and buy, let's say, another car, if you own one car and you buy another car, that's a 100% increase in the number of cars that you bought, yeah? So why is that an issue? You'll never need to draw this, by the way. This is just me illustrating it for you guys, yeah? So if I put two countries side by side, yeah? And I compare the two countries. So price, price, price. Okay, let's say this is the Ivory Coast, because we know that they do cocoa. And over here, let's say this is China. So they do manufactured goods. So supply and demand. S1, D1, that's Q1, P1. Right, I'm going to make our life a little bit easier. I'm going to assume the prices to begin with are equal to each other. I know that's obviously a bit far-fetched, but just to make it easier. All right, so here is the supply and demand for both their goods. Yeah, so obviously the Ivory Coast are selling a primary product, whereas China are selling a manufactured good. Yeah. Now, global incomes are pretty much always going up over time. If you look at history, like global incomes go up almost all the time. The two exceptions to that, the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crash of 2008. Yeah. So what we assume then is that both goods are normal goods, meaning the demand for both are going to go up. But the Ivory Coast cocoa, the demand for it is only going to go up a little bit. So demand does something like this. Yeah, so D2. Okay, so good for them, because can you see that they can now charge a slightly higher price for their cocoa? Great. The problem, though, is that we said that manufactured goods are far more elastic in demand. And therefore, as global incomes go up, the demand isn't just going to go up a little bit. Demand's going to go up like over here. Yeah? And now, suddenly, it's up there. You know how before the prices were equal to each other, which meant that, Q2, sorry, which meant that when the Ivory Coast sold 1 unit to the world, they were able to buy 1 unit from China. Now, when they sell 1 unit to the world, are they able to still buy 1 unit from China? No, they can't. Because their terms of trade, therefore, they're declining. Yeah. And again, these economies need to import capital, machinery, and technology to develop their economy, but they can't, or they struggle to. That is Prebisch Singer in a nutshell. There's a lot of evaluations. The first evaluation that you could talk about is that if they have a comparative advantage in the production of that good, they ought to specialize. That's what economic theory says. And clearly, the Ivory Coast have a comparative advantage because of their climate when it comes to cocoa. Yeah, you can talk about the fact that the Ivory Coast, because of the sorry, forget no, the Ivory Coast. You could talk about other examples of countries that have thrived on the back of their primary products. Examples would include the following: Botswana with diamonds, even though they're going to start struggling because of lab diamonds very soon. They probably already have. Start struggling, but anyways, Botswana with diamonds. Chile with copper, June 2017, paper three, question one, lovely, right? And then the last one is like United Arab Emirates, for example, with oil. Yeah. So these are examples of countries that actually have done pretty well on the back of their primary products. It's not all bad. And then I want to throw in some real world knowledge for you to know. And again, by the way, I get asked a question of like, how relevant and recent does your real world knowledge need to be? Of course, for like key indicators like the UK, which by the way, we are going to release probably tomorrow. It's useful for you to know things like, what the growth rate is, what the inflation rate is, etc. Yeah, and obviously the little stem they give you, the 25 marker is going to help. And then if it's data response, the data's there. Yeah, so don't worry about real world knowledge at that point. But depending on the point you're making, you can actually go back a long, long time. So the point I'm making is going to be this, is that if I look at data between the year 2000 and the middle of 2008, so basically 2000 until the financial crash, the price of commodities, especially oil, were booming. They were skyrocketing, whilst the price of manufactured goods were actually going down. Right. Firstly, what is that a direct contradiction of? That is directly contradicting the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis because it says, hey, countries that are exporting commodities are worse off, and those who export, sorry, manufactured goods are better off. Well, you go, well, no, like between 2000 and 2008, the exact opposite was happening, right? Why? You don't need to know why, by the way, well, you need to know, but like, you need to write this in an exam. It was because of these guys, China. China's economy was growing so rapidly that two things were happening. Number one, what is their main source of growth? Their main source of growth is manufactured goods. They were flooding the world with manufactured goods. The supply of manufactured goods was shifting out, causing the price to collapse. At the same time, two things happen. Number one is in order for them to fuel the manufacturing sector, they're buying loads of oil. Therefore, the demand for oil was skyrocketing. And number two is a lot more Chinese people were entering into the middle classes. Do you remember the extract we briefly looked at earlier about Brazil in the 2013 paper? It was talking about how more Chinese people were buying things like soya beans and I think it was like sugar snap. I can't remember. It says like a few things. What's happening then is that they're buying, there's more demand, a lot more demand for commodities. Yeah. That directly contradicts the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. And again, when I talk about like where do I get my real world knowledge and why I don't want you guys to be spending hours and hours and hours Googling and trying to work like memorize like stats and facts. Real world knowledge is derived through past paper data response because data response is all factual. It's all relevant to your exam board because they wouldn't be able to ask questions about it if they were giving you irrelevant data. So June 2000 and where is it? June 2013, Unit 4. Watch this. I could tell you beforehand, yeah? Basically, it shows the fastest growing economies in the world. And number one on that list between the year 2001 and 2010 is Angola at an average growth rate of 11.1%. You think I know that if I hadn't read this data response? What kind of saddo do you think I am? Pretty sad, not gonna lie. But here you go. Look at this. African economies. Boom. Angola. What's that? That's real world knowledge. And by the way, Angola, their main export is oil. And they talk about Angola in 2013. They talk about Angola 10 years later, 2023. Yeah, there's a whole extract about Angola, external debt relief and transport links and blah, 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 blah. It overlaps. There's only so many ways they can ask you questions. Yes? Happy? Lovely. Cool. We did the limitations to economic growth. Let's deal with strategies to promote economic development and growth. Oh, very quickly, by the way, a very important thing to know. Whenever they ask about economic development, it's a very good idea to keep referencing HDI. HDI is the Human Development Index, and HDI is made up of three components. You need to know this. They can ask like a smaller question on it. But the first is living standards, which is measured by GNI per capita at like, I think, purchasing power at PPP rates. So GNI is like living standards, basically growth, by the way. So whenever growth occurs, you can reference it back to, oh, this therefore increases the GNI, and therefore HDI ranking goes up, right? So that's one. Number two is healthcare, and that's measured by like life expectancy at birth. Don't quote me like go look at exact specifics of this. And then number three is education, with like adult literacy rates and stuff like that, I think. Yeah, cool. Anyways, so if you just keep referencing HDI at the end of each paragraph, you're clearly answering it in terms of economic development and not just economic growth. Economic growth strategies. Now, this is why sometimes Edexcel can be a little bit mean because they can specify a particular strategy that they want you to talk about, that they need you to know that particular theory and be able to explain. Yeah. I want to begin with the Lewis model. Number one, Lewis model. Right. Rebel. 1 second. Right. Are we ready? So, what is the Lewis model? The Lewis model can be summarized in one word, which is industrialize, which means manufacturing. You need to develop the manufacturing sector if you want to develop. And in a nutshell, the theory says the following. It says, look, in many developing economies, there is an excess supply of labor in the agricultural sector. There are far too many farmers on the farm. And therefore, the marginal productivity of labor, right? Fancy word, let's break it up. Marginal, as we know, means an additional unit. Productivity of labor is imagine you add an extra farmer to the already overcrowded farm. How much output is that farmer going to bring to the table? Well, the answer is obviously nothing or next to nothing because they're just getting in each other's way. What is that based on? It's based on a concept you know in theme three, the law of diminishing marginal returns. Yeah. So you go, look, they're just kind of going to get each other's way. This is not actually going to result in any meaningful output. And therefore, the opportunity cost, according to the Lewis model, of moving excess labor out of agriculture and into manufacturing is zero. There is no opportunity cost, right? And then once you develop the manufacturing sector, you gain in two ways. One, you diversify your economy. Your economy is no longer as primary product dependent. But number two is a strong manufacturing sector is likely to attract FDI. And then you can do the good things about FDI. Yeah. Obviously, depending on how many marks the question is worth. Yeah. But is that really clear? Now, sometimes they'll be very explicit and say, hey, like, talk about the Lewis model. We want you to like tell us what the Lewis model is. Other times it's more subtle. Example is this. So, unit four. It says unit four. Yeah, 2015, the India one. Right. Here we go. Look at this 10 marker. 10 marker says, examine the case for the Indian government using policies to stimulate domestic manufacturing as a means of promoting economic development. Okay. Now, the question is not asking you how do you promote the manufacturing sector or how do you improve the manufacturing sector. FYI, by the way, they have asked that in another past paper. That's a different question. You'd like invest into education and training. Maybe you can subsidize your firms. Maybe you reduce corporation tax to attract FDI. I don't know, whatever, right? But that's a different question. Here it's saying, should they develop the manufacturing sector? Absolutely phenomenal candidates would have read that and gone, this is Lewis model. I'm going to explain through the Lewis model. And then you simply turn around and go, hey, listen, Lewis model says this, it says an excess supply of labor in the agricultural sector. Go and move the farmers and explain it that way. Yeah. That is exceptional analysis, like absolutely phenomenal. Let's evaluate it. The evaluation is one of, well, several things. You could talk about any bad things about TNCs. That would also work always. But one of the bad things about TNCs, especially in the manufacturing sector, is that they tend to be footloose. This is one of the things that's on the mark scheme for June 2015. I like this. Yeah. What does that mean? Footloose means that they have zero loyalty to that country. The only reason they are there and using the factories is because it's probably cheaper than other places. If other countries begin developing the manufacturing sector and offering even cheaper labor or better quality manufactured goods, they're off. They ain't going to stick around. And suddenly you've spent all this time developing the manufacturing sector, moving the labor out of agriculture or other sectors into manufacturing, and suddenly now you've got empty factories and lots of structural unemployment. That's a problem. Yeah, does that make sense? So you can basically say, look, this is a risky strategy to pursue because there's a chance that actually they don't stick around because other countries could develop their manufacturing sector and then suddenly your manufacturing sector is not as attractive. Does that make sense? That is an excellent evaluation to the Lewis model. Yeah. I just want to whiz through two or three other ones and then let's move on to another topic. One of the things that I think is very much possible for them to ask about, they haven't since 2017, is tourism. The development of tourism as a means of achieving economic development. Let's go through why. Yeah. In fact, let me quickly show you the question so you can see, and maybe if you've got time, you can practice it later. So old spec, June 2017, the very last iteration of the old spec, has a question about Bolivia, I believe. Here we go. Yeah, Bolivia. Okay. There's a whole extract about tourism, and in particular, the 15 marker. What a dream 15 marker. With reference to extract 3 no knowledge, evaluate tourism as a means of promoting economic development in Bolivia. And this is what I mean, by the way, is that they can sometimes specifically ask you about a certain strategy. June 2018, paper 3, question 2C was about aid as a like the benefits of aid to Indonesia. Yeah. They've asked in the past about external debt relief as the main strategy to promote economic development. They could ask about any of them, really. Yeah. Last year's 12 marker was the bad things about a buffer stock scheme. Yeah. So you guys need to know as many of these strategies as you can know. I'm just going to whiz through a few of them to give you at least a good grounding. Yeah. Okay. Tourism is great. The reason why tourism is so useful to talk about is because the tourism sector, to begin with, is income elastic. It's seen as a luxury good. What does that mean then? As global incomes go up, and remember, global incomes are pretty much always going up, right? There is likely to be a more than proportionate rise in the demand for Bolivia's tourism. And therefore, people are going to now go to Bolivia for their holidays. Right. This might sound a bit weird. Do you guys know if you go abroad and you buy something abroad? So let's say you went to Bolivia and you bought something in the Bolivian economy. What does that count as for Bolivia? It is not consumption, by the way. It is an export. Because think of how exports work. Exports is where something that's made in Bolivia is sent from there to, let's say, the UK. Yeah. So you would be getting the good, but you'd be pumping money into their economy. If you physically go, it's like click and collect. Yeah, you go to Bolivia and you buy the good or service, it's an export. And then the moment we said that exports are going up, we're in happy land. Why? Because we go X minus M is a component of AD, so AD is likely to shift outwards. It is also an injection to the circular flow of income. So there's likely to be a positive multiplier effect. Economic growth is going to go up. Unemployment is going to go down. You can draw the diagram. Go crazy. Love your life. Yeah? Does that make sense? Yeah? By the way, especially if it's a 25 marker, I did a video very recently about how to answer questions on fiscal and supply side policies on YouTube. I highly recommend that you guys watch that because I go through how in a 25 marker, if you've got the time, how you can develop the multiplier in a very, very easy way to get even more depth into your responses, but only for like a 25 marker. You don't have time, as you probably saw on Monday, to do too much. Yeah. That is the analysis. Yeah. I'll deal with the evaluations in a second. Let's do the second analysis very quickly. FDI. Yeah. Do you guys agree that obviously TNCs, especially hotel chains like Hilton, are going to want to set up in countries where tourism is like, a popular destination? Do you have to develop tourism? Yes, you do. The TNC might invest into the infrastructure of the economy, leads to external economies of scale. Labor becomes more geographically mobile. Do you guys agree that it's going to shift out the LRAS curve? Economic development, therefore, is going to go up. The HDI ranking is going to go up. Get the gist? Yeah? Easy peasy? Evals. One of the best evaluations about tourism is that tourism tends to be very fashionable, meaning that as other destinations become more popular, let's say that it becomes a bit trendy on like TikTok, etc., what ends up happening then is that you might see a lot of people moving away from your country to where now the kind of hotspots are, yeah? The example I always give, by the way, is whenever I ask my students, I'm like, what are you doing in the summer? If I rewind about 15 years ago, absolutely no one told me they were going to this destination. Now, most, if not all, my students will turn around to me and be like, I'm going to Croatia. Yeah. Ultra split. See you guys. I'm joking, not gonna go there. Right. But the point is that Croatia is an example of how it's become more popular, right? And the thing about that, by the way, is that do you know one of the main reasons? I know obviously Ultra and the music festival is a big reason why. It's not just that, by the way. Do you guys know why the tourism sector kicked off in Croatia? It was Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, for those of you that are legendary enough to have watched it, except the last season, what a fail. But like Game of Thrones, the King's Landing, all of those scenes are shot in Dubrovnik. Yeah, it's like so people seeing it are like, whoa, where is this like beautiful place, right? And so a lot of people ended up going on holiday to Dubrovnik in Croatia. That's an example of how it could just become more kind of attractive or more popular as a destination. And so suddenly you could end up with less demand for your country. The extract talks about how like Bolivia relative to Peru, if I remember correctly, was not as developed. And so more people might be holidaying in Peru compared to Bolivia, so it might not work. Yeah. Evaluation again, like bad things about FDI. It could be that TNCs come and abuse all your workforce. It could result in like the just seasonal unemployment. Like they're just employing them for like certain times of the year, not throughout the year. They often bring their own managers over, by the way. They don't actually work, train, and develop the skills of the existing workforce. So economic development may be very, very limited. Yeah, that is tourism. Yeah. Okay, let's do one last strategy and then we'll move on. I'm trying to work out which one do I want to do. No, I know what I want to do. Yeah. They can be evil. They can be evil. And what they can do is there are two types of strategies that you guys can be asked about. Yeah. So it could be that you get asked about interventionist strategies or market orientated strategies, right? Those people that watched my live in 2023 probably thank their lucky stars because the 15 marker that year was market orientated strategies. And so many people in the country got 0 out of 15 because they didn't know what that even meant. So they chose two strategies randomly, and those strategies were not market orientated. So can I choose for you? Yeah. I know that there are loads and loads of strategies that you can choose from, but I just want two that are just always going to work on either side, and then you can just develop it. So interventionist. If I got a question about interventionist strategies to promote economic development, without a shadow of a doubt, the first thing that I want you to talk about is education training. 100%. It is the easiest one to develop, yeah? You could talk about how it's going to raise the HDI ranking, of course, more productive workforce, unit labor costs go down. It might allow them to generate export-led growth. It will allow them to basically become like more, human capital level goes up, the skills of the workforce goes up, blah, blah, blah. You can develop it really well, yeah? Eval, is time lag. Yeah, it's just time lag. Yeah, like it's ages. This is not a quick fix. Yeah. Number two, you have a choice. Yeah, but they're both great. I don't mind which one. It kind of depends on the timing. Protectionism is a strategy. So you could talk about infinite industries and how placing tariffs and protecting these industries allows them to flourish, to tap into economies of scale, grow from within, hold out in terms of like, the competition that they have to face. And then once they're ready to basically compete on a global basis, then you could start being more outward looking. Yeah. Evaluate it with it's really bad for domestic like consumers, draw the tariff diagram and go like, consumer surplus is going down by A, B, C, D, bad times. Yeah. Alternatively, if that like is a bit difficult or you're struggling time wise, you can instead invest or improve infrastructure. Okay, so if you improve the infrastructure in the economy, several things are going to happen, right? If you invest into better infrastructure, your labor becomes more geographically mobile, your firm's costs go down, it's going to result in higher levels of profits and things like that, right? So you can develop it in terms of infrastructure. The evaluation could be that it's really expensive. Fiscal deficit, national debt, you know what? That brings me, let's talk about that. Yeah. I will do market orientated in a second, but I just want to talk to you guys about one more thing. Yeah. Within the world of bonds. We spoke about bonds earlier. We spoke about how a bond is a way for the government to borrow money. And I spoke to you about the inverse relationship between the price of a bond and the yield, the interest the bond pays out. Within the world of bonds are these institutions called credit rating agencies. Yeah. So, credit rating agencies are institutions that essentially tell investors how safe or risky that country is. And I only need you guys to know one rating. The top rating across all the agencies is called AAA, like this, AAA. Yeah. If you have a AAA credit rated like economy, like Switzerland, for example, or like Norway, you are the safest of the safe. It means that if you lend money to that government, you're going to get your money back. Like it's coming back. Yeah. And the benefit then is that you'd get high prices for your bonds and very low interest on your bonds, which is really good. You essentially get like really cheap borrowing costs. Yeah. Now, from there on, all I want for you guys to understand is upgrade and downgrade. I'm not interested in like the different rating agencies because they have different rating systems. So like Moody's, who I used to work for, it goes like AA3, AA2, S&P does AA plus. Forget that, yeah? Just AAA and then downgrade, upgrade. Whenever the government is spending money, yeah, you guys are not first year students anymore. You're not going to sit there and tell me opportunity cost, unless it's an eight marker, by which means, by all means, go for it. Anything bigger than that, like a 10, 12, 15, or 25, opportunity cost goes into the nearest bin and remains in that bin. Yeah, we are better than that. What we're going to now do instead is we go, the government is spending loads of money. Infrastructure projects cost millions, billions of pounds. Fiscal deficit goes up. National debt goes up. Now, the UK, if we're doing the UK, it's not the UK, our debt to GDP ratio is roughly about 100%. Yeah, it's really high. If you compare it to what it was in 2007, what is it called? 2017, paper 3, question 2B, go look at it. Yeah. That it was about 35% of GDP pre-financial crash. It then skyrockets to 60% because they have to bail out the banks, right? And now we're looking at about 100% of GDP. Anyways, in a nutshell, you're going to go fiscal deficit higher, national debt higher. It's already a really high debt to GDP ratio. Therefore, the UK could get downgraded. And we already have been, by the way. We got downgraded. We're not AAA anymore. Downgraded the UK credit rating. What is that likely to do to demand for UK bonds? Down. What is that likely to do to the price of UK bonds? Down. Interest on UK bonds therefore go up. Is it easier or harder for the government to service, fancy way of saying pay off their debts? The answer is obviously it's harder. Yeah, that's a problem. That's a great evaluation then to infrastructure spending. Okay, so that's interventionist. Let's do market based. Market based. These are the two that I wanted to do. Oh, I was meant to roll that out, not put a thing around it. Right. Right. Market based or market orientated. It's the same thing. Just in terms of what that means, by the way, so interventionist is where you're trying to grow from within. Yeah. So like another name for it, they don't normally, but you never know actually, it's good to know, is inward looking strategies. Whereas market orientated is the government are taking a back seat. They're letting the free market do its thing. Yeah. And they're trying to grow outwardly, if you like. So it's called outward looking strategies. Yeah. Number one, the first one I want you to do is reduce corporation tax to attract FDI. You've got to link it to, I want you to link it to FDI. Right. How do we develop it? It's very straightforward. If you reduce corporation tax, do you guys agree that that means that firms in your economy have more profits retained? What can they do with the extra profits? They can invest it. They can basically invest into new technology, and they become more globally competitive. They can export more, blah, 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 right? FDI also can come in. I probably would develop it through that actually, because I talk about how TNC is coming in because corporation taxes are lower, will improve the infrastructure in the economy. And again, if you've read the June 2023 paper, the extract, you'll have some real world knowledge to incorporate for like Angola and talk about how like, the ports are outdated and like it allows you to basically develop the economy. LRIS shifts out because of the TNC investing into new technology. And then all the bad things about FDI. You can do that as like evaluations, easy peasy. Yeah. Number two is trade liberalization, right? What does that mean? Trade liberalization is the opposite of protectionism. It's basically globalization. It's where you remove barriers to trade. You engage in more free trade. You might, for example, like join a trading bloc, right? And then you now talk about one of the two things. The one I probably would do is this, is that if you're part of a trading bloc, what you do is that you have free trade and therefore you can tap into your what? Your comparative advantage. You can specialize, and then you can achieve export-led growth. By specializing, it reduces your costs. You can tap into economies of scale, by the way. Yeah, it reduces your costs, and by reducing your costs, it results in lower prices. You become more price competitive. Exports go up. Exports are components of AD. AD is going to shift outwards. Injection, multiplier, AD, bang. Right? Incredible analysis. Yeah. The evaluation is that the problem is that you might become too interdependent upon like other countries that you're now doing loads of your trade with. If they suffer and do really badly, it spills over and affects you, right? It could make you even more primary product dependent. If you're exporting a commodity and that commodity is volatile in price, it's probably not the best idea in the world to be doing this as your means of developing your economy. Yeah, that is economic development or like a good overview of economic development. Hopefully that made sense. Yeah. All right. I want to try and do two more things if my throat will allow me to. Give me one sec. Right, officially the Red Bull has now finished. So we're on reserve energy, but will come in, the water will come in. Right. I think a topic that has not been examined in a meaningful way for a little while is inequality. It was asked as a question in the 2022 paper, and I want to make sure that you guys understand how to answer the two types of questions that can realistically come up. Causes of income inequality and policies to try and fix or reduce income inequality. Yeah? Let's start with the causes. But in order for us to do the causes, I want to show you what I think is the worst single question that has ever been asked for Edexcel in macro. And we have to go back to the year 2012. So let's go back. Let's close some of these so that the laptop doesn't die. That's 2013, so it's another one. All right, 2012 had this absolute horror show. This term marker was hilarious. Hilarious in a bad way. And it said the following. To what extent is income inequality an essential ingredient of capitalism? Okay, can I tell you how you answer this forevermore? Because it can also be asked again. Yeah, it's completely still on the spec. In fact, they actually went and added it into the little textbook that the head examiners write because they had so many complaints that year about this question. So, anyways, in a nutshell, there's a set answer to this. Capitalism is a free market economy. The opposite of capitalism is communism. Yeah. And there are two key features of capitalism that will allow us to explain why it is definitely inevitable that there will be inequality in capitalism. Yeah. So, number one, the first feature of a free market or capitalism is that there is private ownership of assets. Private ownership of assets, right? What does that actually mean? Well, it means that individuals can own things like their house. In communism, the exact opposite, everything is owned by the government, right? Does that make sense? So if I now am able to own my house, do you guys agree that obviously those individuals that accumulate more assets in a free market capitalist economy will obviously be richer compared to those with fewer assets? Is that fair? And therefore they get more wealth. And that wealth inequality feeds into income inequality. Let me explain it with a really simple example. And I'd write this up, by the way, as part of my explanation. I would say, look, people could own assets, and then from the assets, they're able to derive income. So, for example, Imagine I own 7 houses. I definitely don't, but let's pretend I do. Yeah. Do you guys agree that I am probably not going to live in each house one day a week? I have like my Monday house, my Tuesday house. I'm probably going to live in one of my houses. Yeah. And what do I do with the other 6 houses? I go and rent them out. So do you guys agree that I'm now deriving what? I'm deriving rental income. It is not recorded. This is live. It's 9:20, 9:44. Yeah? Right, anyways. So I rent them out. So what am I getting? I'm earning income. Whereas the individuals that don't have the assets that are renting, do you guys agree that they're struggling to even save up to begin with to buy the asset? And their rental income that is going to me, what do I do with that extra money? I go and buy more assets. So that income inequality, wealth inequality feeds into even greater income inequality, which feeds into more income, wealth inequality, and just more inequality. That's really bad. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. That is our first analysis. We go, yeah, for sure, that is going to contribute to inequality. Number two, second feature is the profit motive. In a free market economy, there is the incentive to set up a business because if you are successful, you are going to obviously earn significantly more than individuals that do not, don't take on that risk. Yeah. In other words, the profit motive is necessary in a free market. In a capitalist economy, compare that again to a communist economy. Yeah. So in a communist economy, all the profit is basically held by the government. If I don't have the incentive to innovate, I don't have the incentive to go and set up a business like expert tuition, right? I basically don't have that incentive. Whereas in a capitalist economy, I do. Do you guys agree that obviously the individuals that set up businesses and those businesses are successful are obviously going to be significantly richer than the people that they hire? Jeff Bezos makes more every single year than Jeff the delivery guy. I guarantee you. Yeah. Therefore, is it inevitable? In other words, is it an essential ingredient of capitalism? Of course, it is an essential ingredient of capitalism. That's your analysis set in stone. Just really quickly before I evaluate, by the way, June 2018, paper two has an awful 10 marker. Again, just awkward, but like economics is logical. So even if you see a 10 marker or like a question that you're like, this is not like a set answer that I know in advance, just apply as much logic as possible. It was basically about whether some level of inequality is desirable as a means of like providing incentives. Well, you go, yeah, it is. Because if you know that setting up a business and if it's successful, you're going to earn more money than people that don't do that, then it gives you the risk to go and be an entrepreneur. It gives you the risk, or it gives you the kind of incentive, sorry, to take on that risk, right? It also incentivizes people to go and study, like watching this live, getting better grades and getting into better unis, getting better skills, because then by getting higher skills, you can go and earn higher living. Therefore, is it going to lead to inequality? Yeah, but that actually might be desirable because if it didn't happen, you'd have a shortage of engineers and technicians and tutors and economists. I threw that in. Did you see? Right. But the point is that you can basically say to yourself, hey, look, it is actually desirable because there is that incentive to go and upskill, to develop high quality skills. Make sense? That is how you deal with an awkward question like the June 2018 paper. You can handle it. Right. Evaluation. The evaluation here is set in stone, which is that um, is there actually any example in real life of a pure capitalist economy, meaning there's no government intervention at all? Well, the answer, as far as I'm aware, is no, there isn't, right? Most, if not, in fact, not all, capitalist economies are mixed economies, meaning that there is a free market, but the government do intervene. Therefore, what we basically say is we go, hey, listen, like, yes, there is going to be inequality in capitalism. It's an essential ingredient. The extent of the inequality is not inevitable, though. And this is where you can use the data because the data shows you the Gini coefficient of various countries. So if I look at the data over here, look at figure one. It shows inequality in different parts of the world, right? Do we agree that the USA is considered to be capitalist? Their Gini coefficient is about 0.3738, yeah? Do we agree that we also think of Germany as a capitalist economy? Well, there's a 0.3, yeah? In other words, Germany probably have more progressive taxation. They probably got more policies in place by the government that reduce income inequality, whereas the USA have less, yeah? So in other words, inequality is not it's inevitable, but the extent of the inequality it will vary between one country to the next. Cool. Just really quickly then, that question there, and a very common question they like to ask is like, causes of income inequality, yeah? So can I just whiz through a couple of these to like make sure that you guys know how to answer that? So number one, in terms of a cause of income inequality, it can be really clever. And if it's in the data in particular, you can definitely talk about it. And even if it's not, it's valid, but is capitalism. The answer I just gave you guys a second ago, do you agree that capitalism and the ability to own assets will basically lead to higher levels of inequality? It's inevitable that those individuals that accumulate more assets will be richer compared to those with fewer assets. Does that make sense? That could be one. Number two is access to education. How expensive is education? For example, tuition fees in the UK went up from around £3,250 to £9,000, and then very recently they've gone up again. Do you guys agree that that means that in order for you to get the skills, to get the higher paying jobs, to work in industries like the financial services sector, etc., you need to pay a higher fee to get into uni? And that prices out a lot of people, right? And therefore you go, hey, that's going to contribute. That's a cause of inequality. So there, yeah. Number three, the government in the aftermath of the financial crash in 2010 for about 4 years adopted a policy called austerity. What is austerity? Austerity is significant cuts to government spending. And when the government cuts spending in areas like education, healthcare, who does that impact more? It obviously impacts low-income households more than high-income households. And the reason why is because who's more likely to use state education? Low-income households. Who's more likely to use the NHS? Low-income households. In fact, if I now take you to the year 2022, let's jump in time. So let's go to paper two, which has, I think, my favorite extract because without meaning to, they fully bantered an entire region of kids. Like it was just so uncalled for as well. I'll show you in a second. So it shows like regional inequality, yeah? And it talks about like, like education rates, etc. Yeah. And then we have like, a couple of questions about methods that they could use to increase equality. Oh yeah, here we go. Likely causes of income inequality. It was only an 8 marker though. So could this easily could be a 15 as well, by the way, yeah? Anyways, the reason why this is my favorite extract, for those of you that watched my live before will know I've talked about this, but is because there's an entire part of the passage where it talks about how kids in Rotherham, there we go, yeah, do a lot worse academically than kids in London. Imagine you're sat in the exam in Rotherham and the exam paper is literally cussing your life out. Yeah. I would have walked out. I'd be like, listen, there's no point here. Yeah? Like, what the hell? Right. Even the exam is like just like destroying my life. Right. But anyways, right. The point is that the levels of education and attainment are going to be a big factor that cause income inequality. Yeah. Infrastructure is another cause of income inequality. In areas where the infrastructure spending is high, like London, it says that most of the rail spending, 46% of capital expenditure, this is real world knowledge, right? Is where is London? What does that mean? That means that labor is more mobile in London than it is outside of London. It's much easier for someone in London who's based in South London to go to North London to take up a job. It's much easier to travel into Canary Wharf or Central London to take up high-paying jobs because the transport system is so much more sophisticated in London than it is in like Rotherham and Hull and Newcastle or wherever else. Yeah? Does that make sense? So infrastructure, but also within infrastructure, by the way, you could argue that better infrastructure means more TNCs are going to set up. And more TNCs setting up means more jobs in that area. And therefore, again, income inequality, because in the regions where TNCs are, that's where the high paying jobs are. In the areas where the TNCs don't exist, like outside of London, they're going to struggle to take up high jobs. Yeah. These are exceptional analyses. Yeah. Let's just go through a couple of evaluations. Number one, you could always speak about this, is that nowadays infrastructure might not be as big a deal. And the reason why it might not be as big a deal is because people can work remotely. So if you've got the skills, you can actually apply for high paying jobs that may be based in London, but even if you don't live in London, you're good. Two, HS2. Ironically, yeah. HS2 is being built, and that will help to improve the mobility of labor from like Birmingham to London. It's a bit of a cop out because it was meant to be from Leeds to London, but whatever, right? And so maybe people that can't afford to live in areas like London, it's okay. They can travel into London now more easily, and therefore income inequality might start to basically be decreased. Yeah. Another really good one is in terms of education. While the government could provide bursaries and scholarships for like low-income households to allow people to continue to go to university. Yeah. So maybe it's not as big a deal. And now, very relevant and very, very kind of recent is in the last year or two, the UK government added VAT on private schools. And so you could argue they could use the tax receipts they have from private schools, and that would allow them to improve education standards in areas like Rotherham. Cool. Last thing, in terms of inequality, which is if you get a 25 marker about policies to reduce income inequality, can I choose for you? Because I think there are two exceptional points that are so easy to develop. Number one, without a shadow of a doubt, and it's the one that comes up so many times over and over again, is investment into education and training. It is so clutch, by the way. Investment into education and training programs. Right. Can I just quickly tell you about why education training is like the most amazing thing to know, and it's so straightforward. If you get a question about supply side policies, that's your number one. If you get a question about how to reduce the current account deficit, you could talk about that because it makes you more price and quality competitive. If you get a question like June 2018, which is talking about policies to address the issues of globalization, you say to yourself, what is the problem with globalization? Well, one of the issues is that A lot of companies have outsourced their production process to other parts of the world where costs are far lower, like wage costs are much lower. So a lot of people, like in the manufacturing sector in the UK, they are suffering from structural unemployment. Most of their jobs are now in China, right? So what can you do? You go and invest into education and training programs, and it fixes it. You upskill those people, give them the skills they need to take up new jobs. Does that make sense? Education and training is incredible. If you want to develop your economy and you're not limited to market oriented strategies, education and training, yeah? If you want to get a good grades, you watch this live, education and training, get me, right? Anyways, evaluation that's obvious is that, time lag, yeah? So that very quickly within that paragraph, when I explain education and training and I talk about how like I can, for example, target areas in the UK like Rotherham. I try and incentivize the best teachers to go and relocate to areas like Rotherham, like Mr. Elahi, right? What I do, I incentivize them, for example, by housing subsidies. I might, for example, pay them higher salaries to encourage them to go and live in those areas and work in those areas. Does that make sense? Yeah. But also, we can add some other stuff in there. Investment into education and training. You could talk about how the government could provide better facilities for these areas so that their kids get access to, like, better labs and I don't know, drag it out a little bit, right? But again, the more past papers you do, the more real world knowledge you know. June 2018, paper one, not even paper two anymore, yeah, has a whole extract about a skills shortage in the energy sector. The government can address areas like that, the sectors of the economy where there are job vacancies. If I remember correctly, I think it was like 28 or 29% job vacancies compared to a national average of about 17%, I think it was, or 19%, whatever the number was, right? So you go, oh, look, they can also fix issues like this because they can specifically get people to work in that sector. And the extract again said something that you can now use as real world knowledge. It said there was a shortage of females taking STEM subjects. Go and provide bursaries and scholarships to females from low income backgrounds. Go and give them the skills they need to go and work in the energy sector because that will allow them to take up the jobs that are vacant. It allows them to earn higher pay, blah, 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 right? Then you can drop me the Lorenz curve, the very last thing, and then we'll start wrapping it up. So, Lorenz curve, right. The most common error that people make in the Lorenz curve is not knowing what to label in terms of axes, yeah? On the y-axis, this is how I want to remember it. So one of them is going to be about income, one of them is about population, yeah? So cumulative share of income, cumulative share of population. There is a silly way that I want you to remember it. The word income starts with which letter? I. And can you see my I? Yeah, there's the I. This must be income. The other way to remember it, so that you don't forget in the exam, is in economics, what letter do we use to depict the income? So like think about income elasticity of demand. Well, do you guys agree that we represent it by the letter Y? Yeah? This is the Y-axis. There you go. And then you've got cumulative share of population. And that's also as a percentage. The first thing that you draw is a 45-degree line, right? Mathematicians amongst us, assemble. What is a 45-degree line mathematically? Well, hopefully you would know that it's y equals x. What does that actually mean? In the context of this, it means this is the line of absolute equality. Hallelujah. It means every single person in the economy has the exact same amount of income. Yeah. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen. The reality then is a curve underneath it. So, like that. Yeah. The further away we are from that 45-degree line, the more unequal our society is. Yeah. Now, if I doubt it, yeah, but you never know, like a section A, they've never done it before. The Gini coefficient, the formula, now, if they wanted to, they could give you what A is and what B is. So I need you to know this formula just in case. It's a section A question, yeah? They're definitely not going to get you to like calculate the area under the curve through integration. Like mathematicians amongst us, calm down, yeah? But they could potentially give you what area A is and what area B is and ask you to work out the Gini coefficient, yeah? They've never done it before, but you never know, yeah? And I need you to therefore know what the number is. It ranges from 0 to 1, yeah? Whereby, how do I remember? Again, silly way of remembering it, yeah? 1 looks like what letter? Looks like an I. This is therefore absolute inequality because that also starts with an I. And the other one is absolute equality. Okay. I can't bother to write out. Yeah. Equality. Yeah. I'm tired. Cool. Right. In this context, then, what I could do is I can now shift the Lorenz curve. You don't do A and B when you're shifting it. So let me just get rid of A and B. I could just shift it like this. So, and make sure you point the arrow in the direction. And then you would say, hey, this is going to reduce the UK's Gini coefficient. Woo! Evaluation. Evaluation is massive time lag. This is not a quick fix. It's going to take ages for this to actually have any effect on the economy. And so this is not a quick fix to the immediate problems of the economy. Yeah? That's your first analysis. Second analysis, infrastructure. Build infrastructure. In particular, you could talk about now HS2. HS2 makes it easier for people to move and be more mobile. So labor becomes more geographically mobile, right? Better infrastructure, like for example, if they build like more airports and airports and bridges and stuff, it's going to result in external economies of scale. Many firms in the UK can now benefit, right? And they can therefore hire more workers. You can talk about how a better infrastructure is going to attract more FDI. TNCs are going to come and set up and create jobs. And therefore, if you target infrastructure spending outside of London and other areas, all of this translates into inequality basically decreasing. Yeah. So I would deal with that and develop it. Oh, so one more thing. The last thing I'd add there is I'd explain that they in particular should really focus on making internet connections faster because it will allow people to basically what's it called, work from home, like remote working. Yeah. You can then draw the LRS curve shifting out as well, and then just wrap it up by saying, hey, income inequality is decreasing. The evaluation to that, before this chat, you might have been basic and you might have said something like, oh, opportunity cost, get out of my face. Yeah. We ain't doing opportunity cost. We do fiscal deficit, national debt, credit rating. The HS2, by the way, is estimated to have cost the government about 60 billion. Do you know how much over budget that is? Yeah. It is so over budget. Yeah. So, anyways, in a nutshell, you would basically say it's going to be fiscal deficit, national debt, credit rating could get downgraded. Demand for UK bonds might go down, lower demand, higher, lower price, higher yield. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, I know that a lot of you were asking me to go through the financial sector and the financial crash. Yeah. I have gone through that in a lot of detail in a previous live. So some people have very kindly timestamped underneath the chat all the different kind of parts of previous lives that I have done. I tried to cover as much as I can today within the remit of what is humanly possible within, it's the longest live I've done for you, and hopefully this is really helpful. Guys, ahead of Monday, a couple of things, and after Monday as well, yeah? The first is as many past papers as you can do because it overlaps. Macro, I think, is harder to interpret the questions, but it's easier to understand how to answer. Like the development of the chains of reasoning are much easier, I think, than micro, yeah? That's why most people think that macro is harder, but actually typically do better in macro, most people, my students anyway, because the chains of reasoning are really similar. They're just over and over again, the same stuff, yeah? So make sure that you know them really well, yeah? The second is post exam. Yeah, I got forwarded so many videos. I did a whole video about this. Yeah, I need you guys to stop paying attention to especially silly channels. I don't want to name names, right? That get their clicks and get attention through spouting nonsense. Yeah, I never normally talk about a paper after the exam. Yeah, and I normally just want you guys to leave it in the past. But because of the fact that so many of you are concerned about this, the mark scheme is always done in such a way that once they've read scripts, they add points to it. When they realize that a lot of people thought the interpretation of the question was a certain way, they interpret that and add it to the mark scheme. If you wrote about a monopoly from the perspective of the monopoly or from the perspective of other firms, you have my utter guarantee that you are going to get credit for both of your points. Yeah. It's literally my reputation is on the line. I am 100%. I know it, by the way. I've already spoken to the examiners. I know for a fact they're both credited. Yeah. So anyone telling you otherwise can get into the nearest bin and remain in the nearest bin. But I don't want you to waste your emotional energy and time after an exam panicking about what you wrote. What you wrote is what you wrote. You don't know whether you did well or badly. You will only know in August. So stop concerning yourself about those things, yeah? Smash paper two. Smash it to pieces, yeah? Hopefully you recognize that it's very time pressured and that paper one, those of you would have realized is crazy time pressured. This will be just as time pressured, even more time pressured possibly. I have given you guys on our Instagram, on our TikTok, timings of what you need to do. Stick to the timings. If you see yourself exceeding 5 minutes when it comes to five markers, just leave it. Whatever you've written, let it go. It's okay to drop marks in a five marker, but it's not okay to leave a 15 marker blank or a 25 marker blank. Therefore, just move. Move to the next question. Get on with it. You guys, you're going to do really, really well. And I'll see you guys in about 2 weeks' time for the paper three live. I hope you guys found that really helpful. Thank you very much. And I will see you guys very, very soon.